Preston Caldwell didn't knock. That was the first thing Evelyn noticed, not the sharp smell of his cologne cutting through the office air, not the way his tailored jacket sat too perfectly on his shoulders like a costume rather than clothing. It was the fact that he walked into her office at 7:40 in the morning, without knocking, without pausing, without a single moment of hesitation, as if the door and everything behind it already belonged to him. He dropped a folder on her desk. "Sign the addendum," he said. Page 4. Initial the bottom of pages 6 and 9. Evelyn looked up from her coffee. "Good morning to you too, Preston. The gala's in 3 weeks." He pulled out his phone, already scrolling. "My communications team needs the bio finalized by Thursday. They want to use that photo from the Harrington dinner, the one in the cream blazer. I wasn't aware we'd agreed on that photo. We agreed on the photo." She hadn't. She remembered the conversation differently. But arguing with Preston Caldwell about a photograph at 7:40 in the morning, before she'd finished. Her first cup of coffee was an exercise in futility she had learned to avoid. She opened the folder. If you've ever told yourself you'd do anything at all to save someone you loved, you already understand. Exactly how Evelyn Whitlock ended up here. Sitting across from a man she didn't love, initialing pages in an agreement that had started to feel less like an engagement contract and more like a deed of ownership. She wasn't weak. She wasn't foolish. She was desperate, and desperation has a way of making the impossible feel like the only available door. Before we go any further, if this story is already getting under your skin, do us a favor and hit that subscribe button right now. Every week we bring you stories about real choices, impossible situations, and the kind of love that doesn't announce itself. Drop a comment and tell us what city or country you're watching from. We want to see exactly how far this story travels. Like the video if you're staying until the end, because trust us, you're going to want to see how this one finishes. Now, let's go back to where it actually started. Evelyn Whitlock had not planned to become the kind of woman who kept secrets from herself. She'd grown up in a small house in Cincinnati, with a mother who worked 2 jobs and still found time to iron Evelyn's school blouses every morning, and a father who disappeared when Evelyn was 9 without leaving so much as a note on the kitchen counter. Mary Ann Whitlock, her mother, never talked about the leaving. She just kept ironing, kept showing up, kept moving forward with the quiet, relentless dignity of a woman who had decided that survival was its own form of pride. Evelyn had inherited that quality. At 32, she was a corporate attorney at one of the most prestigious firms in the city, a woman who had clawed through law school on scholarships and summer jobs, who had graduated in the top 4% of her class, who had spent the better part of a decade proving that she belonged in rooms where people like her were rarely invited. She was also, as of 8 months ago, the personal legal counsel to Dorian Blackthorne. Most people in the city knew Dorian Blackthorne's name the way you know the name of a weather system, with the understanding that it was large, largely unpredictable, and capable of causing significant damage if it moved in your direction. He was 41 years old, tall in the kind of way that wasn't about height, but about how he occupied space, with dark eyes that processed information faster than most people could form sentences. His legitimate portfolio included 4 commercial real estate companies, a private equity fund, 2 hotel properties in Manhattan, and a law firm that handled the kind of clients who needed counsel available 24 hours a day. What wasn't listed in any filing or annual report was the rest of it. Evelyn had understood the nature of Dorian's operation within her first 6 weeks of working for him. She hadn't needed anyone to explain it. The late-night calls. The visitors who arrived without appointments and left without speaking to anyone but him. The legal documents that required her expertise but raised questions she had trained herself not to ask aloud. She stayed because the work was real, the salary was considerable, and because Dorian Blackthorne, whatever else he was, had never once asked her to compromise her integrity. He kept her on the legitimate side of his world with a precision that felt almost protective. She did the work she'd been trained to do. She didn't look through doors he kept closed. 4 years later, she was still there. She had told herself it was professional loyalty, career strategy, the kind of positioning that made sense, for someone at her stage in life. She had spent considerably less time examining whether any of that was actually true. The morning Marianne Whitlock called from the doctor's office, Evelyn was in the middle of reviewing a lease amendment on the 43rd floor of Blackthorn Tower. Her mother's voice on the phone was careful in the way that only people trying very hard not to frighten you can be careful. "They found something," Marianne said, "on the scan." Evelyn set down her pen. The something turned out to be advanced stage lymphoma. The oncologist used words like aggressive presentation and systemic involvement and treatment window, and Evelyn wrote all of it down in the margin of a legal pad, because writing things down had always been how she held herself together when everything else was moving too fast. There was a trial, an experimental immunotherapy protocol at a research hospital in Boston that had shown real results in a small cohort of patients with her mother's specific cancer profile. The lead oncologist had reviewed Marianne's case and believed she was a candidate. The cost was $240,000. Insurance covered none of it. Evelyn sat with that number for 3 days. She ran the math every way she could think of. Her savings, her 401k, a second mortgage on the condo she'd bought 2 years ago, personal loan, the equity in the car. None of it came close. All of it combined still left a gap that felt like standing at the edge of a canyon with a piece of rope that was 40 feet too short. She didn't tell Dorian. She didn't tell anyone. She went to work. She reviewed contracts. She answered emails. She called her mother every morning before 8 and every evening after 9, and she kept her voice steady because her mother was already carrying enough. She was still trying to figure out the numbers when Preston Caldwell walked into a benefit dinner she attended on Dorian's behalf, extended his hand, and told her she had the most impressive legal reputation of anyone he'd met in the last 5 years. Preston Caldwell was 46, silver-haired, and possessed of the specific kind of confidence that money and minimal accountability tends to produce over time. He'd made his first significant fortune in waterfront development, turning abandoned industrial properties along the eastern seaboard into mixed-use luxury communities with enough political goodwill and strategic charitable giving to keep the permits flowing smoothly. He was planning to run for office, Senate seat, open district, favorable polling numbers if he could establish the right image in the next 18 months. The right image, his consultants had apparently determined, included a partner, someone accomplished, photogenic and credible, someone who could stand beside him at events without requiring management. He'd noticed Evelyn before she'd noticed him. He was good at that, at watching and calculating and identifying leverage before anyone realized they were being evaluated. 3 days after the benefit dinner, he called her. 5 days after that, they had lunch. By the end of the second week, he had laid out his proposal with the same clinical clarity he probably used to present development projections to his board. "I need a fiancé," he said, over a meal that probably cost more than Evelyn's first monthly rent. "Not a wife. Not yet, and possibly not ever. That's a separate conversation. What I need for the next 12 months is a public partner. Someone whose credentials and presence support the image the campaign is trying to build." Evelyn looked at him across the table. "You're offering me a transaction. I'm offering you a partnership. There's a difference." "Is there?" He smiled. It was a good smile, practiced and warm in the way that things practiced enough times start to feel genuine. "I'm prepared to be generous. If you'd like to discuss specific needs or circumstances that would make this arrangement more attractive to you, I'm open to that conversation." Evelyn thought about her mother. She thought about $240,000. She thought about the research hospital in Boston and the oncologist voice on the phone describing a treatment window that wouldn't stay open indefinitely. She told herself she was just listening. She told herself she wasn't already calculating. She went home that night and sat on the edge of her bed for a long time in the dark. She wasn't the kind of woman who made decisions like this. She had always believed that. She was careful, methodical, principled. She had turned down cases she found ethically troubling even when the money was good. She had left a previous firm rather than participate in document manipulation that a senior partner had dressed up as standard practice. She believed in the version of herself who did the right thing, regardless of the cost. But the cost this time was her mother's life, and the right thing wasn't producing $240,000. She called Preston the following morning and told him she had a condition. He listened. She told him about her mother's treatment. She told him the number. She told him she needed it handled before she signed anything, because she was not willing to enter an agreement and then discover the funding wasn't real. There was a pause. "I'll have my foundation process the transfer," Preston said. "You'll have confirmation within the week." The confirmation came in 4 days. Evelyn signed the engagement agreement on a Friday afternoon, alone in her apartment, with a glass of water instead of wine, because she didn't feel like celebrating. She read every page twice. She initialed everything that required initials. She noted the cancellation clause, the penalty structure, the ring valuation agreement, and filed each page in the folder she'd created for documentation. She never wanted to need, and suspected she might. She put the ring on her left hand. It was a beautiful ring. 3 carats, emerald cut, set in platinum. It felt like a lock. The first 4 weeks weren't terrible. That was the part she hadn't anticipated, how functional the arrangement would feel before it started to show its actual shape. She attended 2 fundraising dinners, a press event, and a policy breakfast. She smiled in photographs. She answered questions about Preston's platform with the measured, thoughtful tone she'd spent years developing in professional settings. His communications team emailed her talking points, which she revised because they were poorly written, and then revised again when his campaign manager objected to her revisions. She met Preston for dinner twice a week. He was attentive in public and largely absent in private, which suited her. He didn't ask personal questions she didn't want to answer. He didn't make demands she hadn't agreed to. He seemed, on the surface, to be honoring the terms of the arrangement. She told herself this was manageable. She told herself she could do 12 months. At work, she kept the engagement quiet for as long as she could. She wore the ring but didn't discuss it. She gave monosyllabic answers when colleagues noticed it. She avoided the topic in the same deliberate way she avoided the topic of anything in her personal life that she wasn't prepared to examine closely. Dorian noticed on a Tuesday. He noticed the way he noticed everything, without drawing attention to the noticing, without asking directly, without making her feel observed. She was standing at the coffee machine in the break area on the 43rd floor, and he walked past and then paused and said, without looking at her, "New ring." It wasn't a question. "Yes," she said. He poured his coffee. "Preston Caldwell," she said, because filling the silence felt less exposed than leaving it. Dorian said nothing for a moment. Then, when did that happen? Recently. He looked at her then. Not the professional assessment he usually gave her, not the quick, efficient reading of information he needed. This was something slower and harder to categorize. "Are you all right?" he said. "I'm fine." He didn't push. He never pushed. He took his coffee and walked back down the hall, and Evelyn stood at the machine watching the remaining coffee drip into her cup and tried to determine why the conversation had left her feeling like she'd just told an important lie. The garment bag arrived at the office on a Wednesday 6 weeks after the engagement was announced. It was delivered by a courier addressed to her professional name, with a card from Preston's events coordinator explaining that the dress had been selected in consultations with his stylist for the engagement gala and that alterations had been arranged for the following Thursday. Evelyn waited until the office had emptied, until the last paralegal had gone home and the cleaning crew had finished the floor below and the building had settled into its after-hours quiet. Then she unzipped the bag. The dress was navy silk. Floor length, cut simply and expensively in the way that things that cost what this had likely cost tended to be. She could see that it was beautiful. She could see that it would photograph well. She could see with the particular analytical clarity that kicks in when emotion threatens to get too large exactly why Preston's team had chosen it. She should have left it in the bag. Instead, she took it to the small private bathroom attached to the conference room at the end of the hall, and she put it on. She stood in front of the mirror for a while. She didn't know what she was looking for. Some confirmation, maybe, that the woman in the reflection was still herself. That the choices she'd made in the last 2 months hadn't fundamentally altered something that she couldn't yet name. The woman in the mirror looked back at her. She looked like a politician's fiancé. She looked like a photograph waiting to be taken. She looked nothing like the woman who'd sat on the edge of her bed in the dark 3 months ago, trying to figure out how to save her mother's life. Evelyn pressed one hand flat against the silk and exhaled slowly. She was still standing there, perfectly still, eyes on her own reflection, when the door opened. She heard him before splitting. She heard him before she processed who it was, the particular cadence of those footsteps, the specific quality of silence that followed the sound of his movement. Dorian Blackthorne never announced himself. He didn't need to. Rooms rearranged themselves around his presence, the way air pressure shifts before a weather front moves through. He stopped in the doorway. She watched him in the mirror. Watched the moment his eyes found her. Watched something cross his face that she had never seen there before, not in 4 years of working closely enough with this man to understand the difference between his controlled expressions and the rare moments when control was briefly insufficient. He looked at her, the way you look at something you've been trying not to want. The silence stretched. Then he said, quietly low and careful, like a man choosing each word with the full understanding that it couldn't be taken back, "Don't go with him." Evelyn turned around. He was still in the doorway. He hadn't moved. He looked, if she was being honest, like a man who had surprised himself. "What did you just say?" she said. Dorian crossed the threshold. He didn't come closer. He stood at the edge of the room with his hands at his sides, and he looked at her with an expression that she was going to be turning over in her mind for weeks. "Your mother's treatment," he said. "The Boston Protocol. The $240,000. Her stomach dropped. "The payment didn't come from Preston Caldwell," Dorian said. It never did. The air in the room felt different. Thinner, somehow, like the pressure had changed. "What are you saying?" she said, and her voice came out more careful than she intended. "I set up the charitable foundation 7 years ago," Dorian said. "Funds experimental oncology trials. It's distributed $11 million in the last 4 years. Anonymous. No strings, no publicity." He paused. "Your mother's case came through the standard intake process. I didn't know it was her until after the approval had already gone through." Evelyn stared at him. "And when you found out?" His jaw moved slightly. "I made sure the transfer completed. And Preston." Dorian's expression didn't change, but something in it hardened. "Preston presented himself as your solution after the payment had already been processed. Whether he knew and didn't verify, or knew and chose to let you believe. Otherwise, I can't prove either. But the money wasn't his." The room was very quiet. Evelyn became aware slowly of the silk dress against her skin, of the ring on her finger, of the engagement gala 3 weeks away and the alterations appointment and the biographical statement his team was waiting for her to finalize. She looked at Dorian Blackthorne, this man she had worked beside for 4 years, who she had categorized and filed and held at exactly the professional distance that made sense. And she understood, with the specific kind of clarity that arrives right before your legs stop feeling entirely reliable, that she had fundamentally misread the situation. Not the situation with Preston. The one she was standing in right now. "Why are you telling me this?" she said. He held her gaze. "'Cause," he said, "you're about to walk into a room full of cameras, wearing that dress and smile for a man who bought nothing except the image of you." Her hands were very still at her sides. "And I'm not going to stand here and watch that happen without telling you the truth. The dress was beautiful. The ring was expensive. The gala was 3 weeks away." And Evelyn Whitlock stood very still in the middle of a room that had just become completely different from the room she'd walked into, and tried to figure out which question to ask first. She didn't move for a long time. That was the thing about moments that restructure everything. They don't arrive with noise. They arrive in the spaces between words, in the particular quality of silence, after something true has been said, and they require you to stand very still while your understanding of the last several months quietly falls apart and reassembles itself into a shape you don't recognize. Evelyn looked at the ring on her left hand. 3 carats. Emerald cut. Platinum setting. Preston had presented it to her over dinner at a restaurant with a 3-month waitlist in front of a table of his colleagues who had applauded. She had smiled. She had said yes. She had held the performance together with the same discipline she applied to everything else in her life, and told herself she was making a choice rather than surviving one. She pulled it off her finger. It came off easier than she expected. Dorian watched her set it on the edge of the counter without comment. His face had returned to something closer to its usual arrangement, controlled, measured, giving away less than it knew, but his eyes hadn't fully followed. There was still something in them that he hadn't managed to put away yet. The foundation, she said. Her voice was level. She'd worked very hard to make it level. You said you didn't know it was her case until after approval. That's correct. And after you found out? I verified the transfer would complete. I didn't interfere with the process. But you knew. She turned fully to face him. For how long? A beat. 6 weeks before Caldwell approached you. Something cold moved through her chest. 6 weeks. And you said nothing. No, she looked at him steadily. The kind of look she used in depositions when she needed someone to understand that she was not going to be satisfied with an incomplete answer, and she was prepared to wait as long as necessary. Why? Dorian held her gaze. Because it wasn't my place to tell you. The foundation operates anonymously. That's not a policy I break for convenience. Convenience, she repeated. Poor word choice. Significant understatement. She crossed her arms, and she was aware that she was standing in a silk evening gown in a conference room bathroom, having what was possibly the most consequential conversation of her adult life. And the absurdity of that did nothing to reduce the particular pressure building behind her sternum. You watched me enter an arrangement with a man who used my mother's illness as leverage. You knew the payment he claimed credit for wasn't his. And you said nothing, for she did the math quickly, nearly 2 months. I found out about Caldwell's involvement 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks. Yes. 3 weeks ago, I was finalizing the biographical statement for the Gala. 3 weeks ago, I sat in a meeting with his communications director and discussed which photographs would be used in the press release. Her voice didn't rise. It never rose. But it sharpened in a way that people who had been on the wrong side of it in professional settings understood was significantly worse than volume. 3 weeks ago would have been a useful time for this conversation. Dorian didn't flinch. She had never seen him flinch. You're right. I know I am. She picked the ring up off the counter and looked at it. What I don't know is what you expect me to do with this information right now, at 9 o'clock at night, 3 weeks before a gala that his team has already sold to 3 separate media outlets. I don't expect anything from you. Then why? Tell me tonight. He was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of someone buying time, the silence of someone deciding how much truth the moment required. Because tomorrow his coordinator sends the final guest list to the venue, Dorian said. And once that happens, extracting yourself becomes substantially more complicated. She stared at him. You've been tracking the gala timeline, she said. I pay attention to things that involve people I'm responsible for. I'm not your responsibility. You work for me. That's not what you meant, and we both know it. The air in the room shifted again. He didn't deny it. That was the thing about Dorian Blackthorne. He was constitutionally incapable of confirming things he hadn't decided to confirm, but he was equally incapable of denying things that were true. It was one of the qualities she had spent 4 years appreciating professionally, and only now, standing in a silk dress she hadn't chosen with a ring she'd removed from her own finger, beginning to understand the fuller implications of. I need to think, she said. All right. Alone. Course. He moved toward the door, paused with his hand on the frame. The dress is yours to keep or return. I have no opinion on that. That's a lie, she said. You have an opinion on everything. Something almost crossed his face. Almost. Good night, Evelyn. He left. She stood in the bathroom for another 4 minutes, which she knew because she watched the seconds tick on her watch, with the specific focus of a person who needs something concrete to hold on to while the larger architecture of their life is undergoing unexpected renovation. Then she changed back into her work clothes, put the ring in her coat pocket, zipped the garment bag closed, and went home. She didn't sleep. She lay on her back in her apartment and stared at the ceiling and did what she always did. When a problem exceeded the reach of immediate solution, she broke it into components. Component 1. Preston had presented himself as her financial solution. The money he claimed to have provided had, in fact, come from a foundation he had no connection to. This meant the foundational premise of their agreement, the exchange she had rationalized as a reasonable transaction, was fraudulent on his side, regardless of whether his ignorance was genuine or manufactured. Component 2. Dorian had known for 3 weeks that the premise of her arrangement was false. He had chosen to inform her tonight rather than earlier, citing Foundation protocol, which was either the truth or a partial truth, dressed up as a complete one, and she did not yet have enough information to determine which. Component 3. The cancellation clause. She sat up. She'd read it twice when she signed the agreement. She'd noted it and filed it away in the mental folder she kept for things she hoped wouldn't become relevant. Penalty structure for breach of contract initiated by Evelyn, $200,000 in liquidated damages, forfeiture of the ring, and a non-disparagement clause that would prohibit her from discussing the terms of the arrangement publicly for 5 years. $200,000, which was $10,000 less than her mother's treatment had cost. She lay back down and breathed through her nose for a while. Preston Caldwell had not been sloppy. That was the part she needed to hold on to. He was not a man who made careless agreements. The penalty structure was specific and considered. He had calculated, when he drafted that contract, exactly how much it would cost her to leave, and he had set the number high enough to function as a cage without being so obviously punitive that it would have alarmed her on first reading. He'd known she would read it carefully. He'd designed it to survive careful reading. She got up at 5:30, made coffee she barely tasted, and drove to the office 2 hours before anyone else arrived. Preston called at 8:15. She let it go to voicemail. Called again at 8:40. She listened to both messages. It's like green wood splitting. His voice in them was smooth and practiced, the tone of a man who was accustomed to having things returned to their correct positions when he applied the appropriate pressure. He mentioned the Gala coordinator. He mentioned the Thursday alteration appointment. He mentioned with a lightness that wasn't light at all that the biography statement really did need to be finalized by end of day. She deleted both messages and opened her laptop. She spent the next 2 hours pulling every piece of publicly available information on Preston Caldwell's development portfolio that she could access. Environmental filings, municipal permit records, property transfer documents, zoning variance applications across 4 counties. She read everything with the focused, detail-oriented attention that had made her exceptionally good at her job, and somewhere around the 90-minute mark, she began to see the shape of something she hadn't been looking for. She was still reading when her office door opened without a knock. Preston Caldwell in her office at 10 in the morning was a different calibration than Preston Caldwell at charity dinners and political breakfasts. Polish was still present. It was structural. She understood, built into the way he moved and held himself. But there was something underneath it now that she could see because she was looking differently than she had been 12 hours ago. "You didn't return my calls," he said. "I was reviewing documents." "The biography statement." "Sit down, Preston." He paused. He wasn't accustomed to being directed. She watched him process the instruction and decide, for reasons of his own, to comply. He sat in the chair across from her desk. She folded her hands on the desk surface and looked at him. "Tell me about the treatment payment," she said. Nothing moved in his face. That was, she noted, its own form of information. An innocent man would have looked confused. "I don't know what you mean." "The $240,000. The Boston Protocol. Tell me how that payment was processed." "Through the foundation, I told you that." "Which foundation?" A very small pause. "The Caldwell Family Foundation." "Do you have documentation of the transfer?" "My financial team handled the details." "I can have them pull the records." "Please do." His eyes moved across her face, reading her the way he read everything as a landscape to be assessed for value and vulnerability. "Is something wrong?" "I'd like to see the transfer documentation before the end of the day." "Evelyn," his voice shifted warmer. "More personal. The register he used when he wanted her to feel like she was being seen rather than managed. What's going on? Talk to me. She looked at him for a moment. At the practiced warmth of his expression and the absolute stillness behind his eyes. At the man who had sat across a restaurant table from her and laid out a transaction as if it were a partnership, who had known or should have known that the money he was offering her wasn't money he was giving at all. I'm talking to you, she said. I'm asking for transfer documentation. This feels adversarial. I'm an attorney. I ask for documentation. It's not adversarial, it's professional. She kept her voice even. I'd like the records by 4 o'clock. He studied her for another moment. Then he stood, adjusted the front of his jacket with a small, precise movement, and nodded once. I'll have my team send them over, he said. He left without saying goodbye. She waited until she heard the elevator. Then she picked up her phone. The records arrived at 3:47. She went through them in 13 minutes. The payment had been processed through a foundation, but not the Caldwell Family Foundation. The originating account belonged to a charitable trust called the Aldrin Medical Initiative. She'd never heard of it. She ran the name through the databases she had access to and found a 501 CT3, registered in Delaware 4 years ago, with no public-facing leadership listed, and an operating address that turned out to be a law firm specializing in trust administration. She sat with that for a moment. Then she picked up her phone and called the one person who, she was now relatively certain, already knew exactly what she was going to find. Dorian picked up on the second ring. The Aldrin Medical Initiative, she said without preamble. Pause that lasted less than 2 seconds, but was more informative than most people's paragraphs. Yes, that's yours. It's administered through a separate legal structure. That's not what I asked. Another pause. The funding structure traces back to an entity I control. Yes, she closed her eyes briefly, opened them, so to be completely clear. When Preston provided me with transfer documentation today, the records showed payment from a foundation that is ultimately yours. That would be consistent with what I've told you. What you've told me, she said, is that your foundation processed the payment anonymously, and you didn't know it was my mother until after approval. What you haven't told me is whether Preston knew the money wasn't his before he presented it to me as his. The silence this time was different, thinner. I have reason to believe he was aware the payment originated externally, Dorian said carefully. You have reason to believe. I have information suggesting he investigated the source and chose not to disclose it. He knew, her voice was flat. He knew the money wasn't his, and he presented the payment to me as his own philanthropy in exchange for an engagement agreement with a $200,000 cancellation penalty and a 5-year non-disparagement clause. Yes, she said nothing for a moment. That's fraud, she said. In the civil sense, yes. Possibly criminal, depending on jurisdiction and how a prosecutor chose to characterize the inducement. And you've known this or suspected it for 3 weeks. I've had it confirmed for 8 days. She pressed 2 fingers against her mouth and breathed through her nose. Dorian, I understand. I don't think you do. She stood up from her desk because sitting still was no longer something her body was willing to participate in. I entered a legally binding agreement with this man. I signed documents. I attended events. I submitted a biographical statement. I have been photographed on his arm at 4 separate public functions. And for 8 days you have had confirmation that the foundational premise of that agreement was fraudulent, and you said nothing. I was determining the correct approach. The correct approach was a phone call. The correct approach, he said, and his voice had shifted, still controlled, but with something underneath it that she recognized as the closest Dorian Blackthorne ever came to emotion in a professional context, was making sure that when I told you I had something more than suspicion, that I had documentation you could use, that you weren't walking into a confrontation with Preston Caldwell, armed with nothing but my word. She stopped moving. What documentation, she said. Environmental compliance reports on 3 of his waterfront properties. They were altered before submission. The originals show contamination levels that should have blocked the permits entirely. There are also financial transfers between two of his development LLCs and a shell company registered in the Caymans that don't correspond to any disclosed contractual relationship. She was very still. How long have you had this? Long enough. That's not an answer. It's the answer I'm giving you right now. His tone wasn't evasive. It was the particular quality of honesty that knows exactly where its own limits are. What I'm telling you is that if you want out of this agreement, you have grounds that extend significantly beyond a personal dispute. And if he retaliates, he won't. You don't know that. Evelyn, his voice dropped slightly. Not soft or more direct. The register he used when he wanted her to hear precisely what he was saying. He won't. She understood what he meant. The understanding sat in the room with her like a third presence, large and unspoken, and carrying its own weight. I need to confront him, she said. I know, today. That's your decision. I'm going to return his ring. Dorian said nothing, and I need you to stay out of it until I've had the conversation myself, she said. Whatever you have on him, whatever leverage you've been sitting on, I need to do this part first. On my own terms, do you understand? Yes, I mean it. If I walk into that office and I find out you've already made a call or sent a message or done anything to preemptively alter the dynamic. I haven't, Dorian. I haven't, he said again, and the plainness of it was enough. Go have your conversation. She hung up. She stood in the center of her office for a moment, with her hand still wrapped around the phone, feeling the specific way her pulse was moving too fast. Not panicked. Particular rhythm of a person who has just committed to a course of action and is now experiencing the full weight of that commitment landing. She picked up her coat. She reached into the pocket, and her fingers closed around the ring. Then she walked out. Preston's office was in a building 12 blocks east, a converted warehouse property he'd developed himself, which felt, as she stepped through the glass lobby doors, like exactly the kind of detail that should have told her something earlier. His assistant, a young woman who had been trained to the specific efficiency of someone accustomed to managing constant access requests, looked up and started to say something about scheduling. He'll see me, Evelyn said, and walked past. She was right. He did. Preston was standing at his window when she pushed the door open, hands in his pockets, looking out at the waterfront. He turned when she came in, and she watched his face run through a quick recalibration surprise. Then assessment, then the smooth professional pleasantness he defaulted to when he needed to buy himself time. Evelyn, he gestured toward the chairs. I wasn't expecting. The Aldrin Medical Initiative. She stopped in the middle of the room and looked at him. That's where my mother's treatment payment actually came from. Not the Caldwell Family Foundation. Not you. The pleasantness didn't disappear. It shifted, became more deliberate. I don't know where you're getting. Don't. The single word came out with enough weight that it stopped him mid-sentence. You investigated the source. You knew the money wasn't yours before you presented it to me. You used a payment you had no connection to as the basis for a financial agreement with a $200,000 exit penalty. He was quiet for a moment. Then he crossed to his desk and sat down, and the shift was significant from the man at the window to the man behind the desk. A geographic relocation that was also a declaration of positioning. You're a lawyer, he said. You understand that the origins of charitable funding can be complex, and that… I'm a lawyer, she agreed, which is why I also understand that inducing someone to enter a contract through deliberate misrepresentation of a material fact constitutes fraud. In most jurisdictions, including this one. Something moved behind his eyes. Not fear. Preston Caldwell was not a man who frightened easily, and she respected that even as she understood it was currently her primary obstacle. It was calculation, the rapid, efficient reassessment of a man who had just realized the terrain had shifted without his knowledge. You're being dramatic, he said. We had an arrangement. A mutually beneficial, I'm terminating the arrangement. She reached into her coat pocket and set the ring on his desk. It made a small, clean sound against the wood. I won't be attending the gala. I won't be signing the finalized biography. I won't be available for further campaign events. He looked at the ring, then he looked at her. The pleasantness was gone now. What replaced it wasn't anger exactly. It was something colder and more considered. the expression of a man who has prepared for this contingency. The cancellation clause, he said. I'm aware of it. $200,000, plus the ring valuation, plus the non-disparagement provisions. I've read the contract, Preston. Twice. Then you understand that walking out of here today triggers obligations that. What I understand, she said, is that a contract induced by fraud is voidable. What I also understand is that I have access to environmental compliance documentation on 3 of your waterfront permits that would be of significant interest to the regulatory agencies that issued them. The room went very quiet. She hadn't planned to say that. She hadn't fully decided, in the elevator on the way up, how far she was going to go. But something about the way he'd looked at the ring proprietarily, the way you look at something that belongs to you, had made the decision for her. His jaw tightened, just slightly. Where did you get that? It's publicly available documentation, she said. Some of it. The rest she left the sentence open. The way you leave a door slightly ajar to let some see what's on the other side, without fully committing to letting them in. I've been thorough. He was very still. You want to be careful, he said quietly, about the company you keep and the claims you make on their behalf. I'm making them on my own behalf, are you? He tilted his head slightly. Because this feels like a conversation that was prepared for you. She held his gaze. I prepared this conversation myself. In my own office, with my own research, over the course of today. If you'd like to spend your energy trying to help me get here instead of dealing with the substance of what I'm telling you, that's your prerogative. But I'd suggest it's not the most productive use of the next 30 minutes. He looked at her for a long time. Then he looked at the ring again. You're making a significant mistake, he said. I've made significant mistakes before, she said. This isn't one of them. She turned and walked toward the door. Penalties don't disappear because you walk out, he said behind her. His voice had gone flat and deliberate in a way that was, she recognized, a genuine warning rather than a performance of one. I will pursue every provision in that contract. I will make this expensive. And I will make sure everyone in this city who matters understands exactly what kind of professional conduct you're capable of. She stopped with her hand on the door. She didn't turn around. Then I guess we'll both find out what everyone in this city who matters already knows about your permits, she said. She walked out. She made it 3 blocks before her legs informed her, with some authority, that they were done pretending everything was fine. She found a coffee shop, took a corner table, ordered something she didn't look at, and sat with both hands wrapped around the cup while her heart rate made its way back down from the register it had been operating in for the last 40 minutes. Her phone was buzzing. Preston's name. Twice. Then his attorney's name, a number she didn't have saved but recognized from the contract documentation. She declined both calls and sat very still and thought about what came next. What came next was the penalty clause. $200,000 she didn't have. A non-disparagement agreement that had enough teeth to affect her professional reputation for 5 years. A man with the resources and the motivation to make extracting herself as painful as possible. What also came next, she understood now, was that she had just told Preston Caldwell she had access to information about his permits, which meant the clock on whatever Dorian had been holding was now running. She picked up her phone, she started to dial, then she set it back down, because she needed 1 more minute of the problem being only hers, before she invited anyone else into it. She looked out the window at the street, at people moving past with the particular purposeful distraction of city pedestrians, each one living inside a situation entirely invisible to everyone around them. She thought about her mother. She thought about the dress hanging in the garment bag in her office. Thought about the ring she'd left on Preston Caldwell's desk, and the look on his face when she'd set it down, not wounded, not surprised, but recalculating, and she understood, with the full weight of the understanding arriving at once, that she had just made herself into an enemy of a man who treated enemies as problems to be managed rather than people to be reckoned with. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a text. It was from a number she didn't recognize. It said, "The penalties will be enforced. All of them. And we'll start by notifying the Bar Association about the nature of your professional relationship with Dorian Blackthorne. She read it twice. Then she put the phone down on the table and breathed. Preston hadn't wasted any time. He was going after her license. She picked the phone back up and called Dorian. He answered before the first ring finished. "He's moving against my bar license," she said. "He just sent a threat through a third number, probably a paralegal or a burner. He's going to claim my relationship with you is professionally compromising." Pause. Very short. "When did you send the text?" "I didn't send—" She stopped. "It came to me. He's threatening to file a complaint." "All right." His voice was calm in the specific way that isn't the absence of urgency, but the presence of focus. "Come back to the office." "Dorian." A beat. "Come back to the office." She looked at the untouched coffee in front of her. Then she stood up, left money on the table, and walked back out into the street. She had ended the engagement. She had returned the ring. She had made an enemy of a man with significant resources and no apparent hesitation about using them, and she had done all of it in the space of a single afternoon without a plan for what came after. There was no going back to this morning. There was no version of the next 24 hour in which anything returned to the shape it had been, before she put on a dress in an empty office, and a man she'd worked beside for 4 years told her the truth. About money she'd built her last several months around. She walked. The city moved around her, indifferent and continuous, the way cities always are when your life is doing something unprecedented. Her phone buzzed once more. A second text from the same number. "We'll also be notifying the press. Engaged woman and her mafia employer. That story writes itself." She read it. She didn't stop walking. But something settled in her chest, something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite fear, and was, she thought, the specific quality of resolve that arrives when a person understands that the ground has shifted completely and the only available direction is forward. Preston Caldwell had just made the mistake of believing she had something left to lose. She walked back into Blackthorn Tower at 4:53 in the afternoon, with her coat still on and her phone in her hand, and the particular quality of stillness that belongs to a person who has been moving too fast for too long and is now operating on something closer to autopilot than intention. The lobby security nodded at her. She nodded back. A sound. The elevator came immediately, which felt wrong. She could have used 30 more seconds to figure out what she was going to say when the doors opened on 43. She didn't figure it out. The doors opened anyway. Marcus Webb was waiting in the hallway. Marcus was Dorian's operations director, 47 years old, former military, built like someone had assembled him specifically for the purpose of occupying doorways. Splitting. He'd always been professionally courteous to Evelyn in the way that people are courteous to someone whose exact position in the organizational hierarchy they've never been entirely sure of. Tonight he looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. "He's in the conference room," Marcus said. "There's someone with him." "Who? Come see." That was also new. Marcus didn't do cryptic. She followed him down the hall. The conference room had glass panels along the interior wall, and through them she could see Dorian standing at the head of the table with his jacket on, and his hands flat on the surface, which was his particular posture for conversations he was managing rather than having. Across from him sat a man she didn't recognize, late 50s, heavy through the shoulders, wearing a suit that was expensive but not current, the kind of wardrobe that communicated money without caring about impression. There was a third person. She recognized him immediately, and the recognition landed in her stomach like a stone dropped into still water. Gerald Fitch. Gerald Fitch was a senior partner at the Bar Association's Professional Conduct Committee. She had met him twice at legal association events, once 3 years ago, once last spring. He was not the kind of man who made social visits. He was not the kind of man who appeared anywhere without a specific and considered reason. She pushed the conference room door open. All three of them looked at her. Dorian's expression gave her nothing. Gerald Fitch's gave her slightly more, a particular, careful neutrality that people in investigative positions develop as a professional habit. The third man, she still didn't know, looked at her the way you look at a variable you've been accounting for that has just walked into the room on its own. "Evelyn," Dorian said. Not a greeting exactly, more like an acknowledgement of a development. "What is this?" she said. Gerald Fitch cleared his throat. Ms. Whitlock, I apologize for the timing. We received a formal complaint this afternoon through our expedited submission process. Given the nature of the allegations, our protocols require. How long ago? She said. He glanced at his watch. The complaint was timestamped at 4:07. She'd left Preston's office at approximately 3:40. He had filed within 30 minutes of her walking out. She'd underestimated the preparation. He hadn't been threatening, he'd been announcing. The text messages had been notification, not warning. The complaint was already drafted before she'd set foot in his building. She pulled out the chair at the near end of the table and sat down, because standing was starting to cost more than she wanted to spend on posture. What are the specific allegations? She said. Fitch opened the folder in front of him. The complaint characterizes your professional relationship with Mr. Blackthorne as ethically compromised, citing a pattern of conduct it describes as deliberate facilitation of business activities that you knew or should have known carried legal exposure. It also alleges that you have used your position as his legal counsel to access privileged commercial information for personal leverage in private negotiations. The room was very quiet. The second allegation, she said. He's claiming I used privileged information against him. The complaint characterizes your conduct in your meeting with Ms. Caldwell this afternoon as constituting unauthorized disclosure of information obtained through your professional position. No ground. She thought about what she'd said in Preston's office, about environmental compliance documentation, about permits. She hadn't disclosed anything she'd implied access. She'd left a door open, but in a formal complaint characterized by someone with Preston's resources and his legal team's drafting ability, the implication and the act would be made to look identical. I didn't disclose privileged information, she said. I referenced publicly available permit records. The complaint characterizes it differently. The complaint is written by Preston Caldwell's attorneys. That's accurate, Fitch said, which is noted in the intake documentation. The committee will conduct its own review. However, he paused, and she recognized the pause as the particular hesitation of someone who is about to say something that has professional consequences and who is trying to say it as precisely as possible. The expedited process, given the public profile of both parties involved, requires us to issue a temporary suspension of practice pending investigation. She heard the words. She processed them individually. Temporary suspension of practice, pending investigation. She had been an attorney for 9 years. She had passed the bar on her first attempt. She had never had a complaint filed against her. She had a bar record that was, to this point, entirely clean, and she had maintained that record through the kind of deliberate, consistent professional conduct that was not accidental but chosen every day, in every case. At every decision point where the easier option was also the less correct one. How long, she said. Her voice was very even. The expedited review typically concludes within 60 to 90 days. And during that period, you would be unable to practice law, in any capacity, including your current position. The third man, the one she still hadn't identified, shifted slightly in his chair. She looked at him directly for the first time. Who are you? He had the grace not to pretend he hadn't been waiting for the question. Jonathan Price. I represent the firm's insurance carrier. Of course, the malpractice insurer, because a bar complaint against the firm's lead counsel triggered a review of the firm's liability exposure. Preston had not filed one complaint. He had filed a complaint specifically designed to cascade the Bar Association, the insurer, the firm's professional standing, all of it activating simultaneously from a single document submitted at 4:07 in the afternoon. She looked at Dorian. He was watching her with an expression she still couldn't entirely read, but there was something in it, a tightness around his jaw. Quality to the stillness of his hands on the table that was the closest she'd ever seen him come to something that looked like guilt. You knew this was coming, she said. I knew it was a possibility. Before I walked into his office, a beat. Yes, and you didn't tell me. I told you he wouldn't retaliate against you. You said he wouldn't. Her voice stayed level by a margin she was actively maintaining. You were wrong. I underestimated the preparation. The complaint was pre-drafted. He filed it the moment you left the building. I know when he filed it. She looked at the folder in front of Gerald Fitch. I know exactly when he filed it because I was still 3 blocks away when my phone told me he'd already moved. Assent soon. Fitch was watching the exchange with the careful attention of a man who understands he's witnessing something significant and is professionally obligated to observe and say nothing. Evelyn pressed both palms flat on the table. Gerald, I need 48 hours before the suspension is formalized. Fitch looked uncomfortable. The protocol has a provision for contested complaints with supporting documentation. I've read it. I know because I helped Togs navigate it in the last 4 years. She held his gaze steadily. I am asking for 48 hours to prepare a formal response with documentation that directly addresses each allegation. If the committee reviews that response and still determines the expedited suspension is warranted, I won't contest it. Fitch looked at the man from the insurance company, then at Dorian, then back at her. 24 hours, he said. I can authorize 24. I'll take it. He closed the folder and stood. Jonathan Price followed. Marcus showed them out. The door closed behind them, and then it was just Dorian and Evelyn in a conference room at 5 o'clock in the evening, and the particular quality of the silence between them was not comfortable. She waited until she heard the elevator open and close in the lobby. Tell me what you actually know, she said. All of it. Not the version you've been curating. Everything, he told her. It took 22 minutes, and she listened, without interrupting, which was one of the harder things she'd done in a day that had required a significant amount of hard things. Dorian stood at the window for most of it, not looking at the city, but at a point somewhere between himself and the glass. And he spoke with the particular flat clarity of someone who has decided that complete honesty is the only remaining viable option. The environmental documentation went back further than she'd understood. 3 years. Dorian had first become aware of irregularities in Preston's permits during a business overlap. A waterfront property adjacent to one of his own developments had triggered a contamination review that bled into Preston's neighboring permits. Dorian's people had pulled the filings as due diligence. What they found wasn't accidentally irregular. It was systematically manipulated. He'd kept the documentation. He'd also, in the 3 years since, accumulated additional material. The Cayman transfers she'd referenced in Preston's office. Financial relationships between 2 of Preston's shell entities and a logistics company with a documented history of regulatory violations in 2 other states. And she felt this land differently than the rest records that suggesting Preston's aspirations were hafted by sources he had not disclosed in his campaign filings. Campaign finance violations, federal jurisdiction. She looked at Dorian when he got to that part. How long have you had the campaign finance material? 8 months. She absorbed that. You've had federal-level leverage on a man who is now attempting to destroy my professional career. And you've been sitting on it for 8 months. The timing of using it matters. The timing. She said the word carefully, tasting it. You've been waiting for the right moment. I've been waiting for a moment where using it doesn't expose the methods by which I obtained it. And how did you obtain it? He looked at her. You don't want to know that. I'm asking Evelyn. His voice was quiet but definitive. You're an attorney with 24 hours to prepare a defense of your license. You don't want to know how I got that material before you walk into a room with the Bar Association. She held his gaze for a long moment. He was right. She hated that he was right, and she hated how well he understood the specific geometry of her situation. And she hated most of all the fact that she'd walked into Preston's office this afternoon, armed with half the picture, and a confidence built on incomplete information, and that the gap between what she'd known and what was actually true had just cost her license for the next 24 hours at minimum and possibly 90 days at maximum. What do I use, she said, for the response. What can I use? The publicly available permit records. I'll have everything compiled and sourced by midnight. That's not enough to counter a fraud allegation backed by his legal team. No. But it's enough to establish that your references to permit documentation were factual rather than privileged. It reframes the disclosure claim. He paused. The fraud allegation is the one we address separately. How? He was quiet for a moment. The Aldrin Medical Initiative transfer records. I'll provide complete documentation showing the payment originated from my foundation before Preston became involved. That establishes the misrepresentation independently of anything you said in his office. You'll provide it. Yes, which means you'll be disclosing the foundation's existence and its connection to your holdings in a formal legal proceeding. Yes. She looked at him for a long time, understanding slowly what that meant. The Aldrin Medical Initiative had operated anonymously for a reason. Connecting it to Dorian Blackthorne in a formal document submitted to the Bar Association meant connecting Dorian Blackthorne to a charitable operation that functioned through a legal structure specifically designed to obscure its origins. It wouldn't expose anything criminal, but it would pull back a layer of privacy he'd maintained deliberately for years. You'd do that, she said. I already decided to do it. Tonight, she breathed. Why? Because you're facing a complaint that shouldn't exist, built on a fraud that I had the information to prevent and didn't. His jaw tightened slightly. And because you asked me to stay out of your conversation with him, and I did. And the result is that he had 20 minutes more preparation time than I anticipated. You're blaming yourself. I'm acknowledging a miscalculation. Dorian. She said his name the way you say the name of someone you're trying to get to stop managing a conversation and participate in it. He had that complaint drafted before I walked in. Whether you'd warned me or not, whether you'd made a call or not, he was filing it the moment I returned the ring. That was always the plan. He said nothing. You couldn't have prevented it, she said. You could have told me it was coming, so I wasn't standing in Gerald Fitch's field of vision trying to process the word suspension in real time. You could have done that, but the complaint itself, that was already written. The silence held for a moment. I should have told you it was coming, he said. Yes, you should have. They looked at each other across the length of the conference table, and she was aware that they were having two conversations at once, the one about strategy and documentation, and 24 hours, and the other one, the one they'd been not quite having for 4 years, that kept surfacing in the spaces between the first conversation sentences. She stood up. I need to work. Get me everything by midnight. It'll be there. She picked up her coat, got to the door, stopped with her hand on the frame in almost the same position he'd occupied the night before, and the symmetry of it didn't escape her. The campaign finance material, she said, without turning around. When you decide the timing is right, I'll handle it. Carefully. Always. She left. She worked through the night. Not at the office at her kitchen table, with her laptop and 3 legal pads and the documentation Dorian's team delivered to her building at 11:47 p.m. via a courier, who handed her a flash drive with the particular expressionless efficiency of someone who does this regularly. She made coffee at midnight, made more at 2:30. Sometimes some around 4 in the morning. She moved from the kitchen table to the couch without intending to, and woke up 40 minutes later with her face against a legal pad and a crick in her neck that took 3 minutes of careful movement to address. She showered, changed, made more coffee. By 6:15 she had a response document that was, she believed, solid, sourced, factual. The permit references were backed by public record. The Aldrin documentation established the fraud independently. The characterization of her conduct in Preston's office as privileged disclosure was directly contradicted by the public nature of the underlying records. She read it through twice more. Then she called her own attorney, a woman named Sandra Park, who had been Evelyn's law school classmate and who practiced in professional conduct defense because Evelyn had made a point years ago of knowing who to call for this specific scenario, not because she'd expected to need it, but because knowing who to call was the kind of preparation that didn't become relevant until it suddenly and completely was. Sandra answered on the 3rd ring, which suggested she had been awake for a while. I saw the complaint filed yesterday, Sandra said, before Evelyn could get past hello. It came through the notification list around 5. I was wondering if you'd call. I have a response document. Send it. Evelyn sent it. 14 seconds of silence. Then the sound Sandra reading, which was brisk and specific. Okay, the permit framing is good. The Aldrin documentation is a pause substantial. Where did you get the Aldrin records? directly from the Foundation's administrative structure, meaning Blackthorne provided them. Yes. Which he's willing to have on record. Yes. Another pause. That's either very calculated or very significant, and I can't tell from here which one. It might be both, Evelyn said. All right. Sandra's voice shifted into its professional register, which was efficient and clear and comforting in the specific way that competence is comforting. The response is good. It doesn't fully neutralize the complaint the committee will still review because of the public profile issue, but it's strong enough to make the expedited suspension harder to justify. I'll call Gerald Fitch at 8 when his office opens. Thank you, Evelyn. Sandra's voice changed slightly. Complaint is aggressive. The timing is aggressive. Whoever drafted this was planning to file it, regardless of what you did in that office. I know, which means this isn't about your conduct. It's about pressure. I know that too. Is there anything else he can file? Any other vector I should be anticipating? She thought about it. About the things Dorian had told her last night, and the things he hadn't, and the specific geography of what Preston Caldwell knew, and didn't know, and thought he could use. Possibly, she said. I'll call you if something moves. She hung up. She sat at her kitchen table in the gray early morning light with her hands wrapped around a coffee mug that had gone cold without her noticing, and she thought about the fact that she had gone to Preston's office yesterday afternoon with the intention of ending an arrangement cleanly, and instead had triggered a response so fast and so prepared that it had the feel of something that had been waiting, sitting in a drawer, somewhere already drafted, already processed through his legal team for exactly this moment. He hadn't built the trap when she walked out. He had built it before she walked in. The engagement agreement, the cancellation penalties, pre-drafted complaint, the cascade structure designed to hit the bar association, the insurer and the firm's liability simultaneously. He had known from the beginning that the agreement was extractable only at a cost she couldn't pay, and he had designed the cage with the specific dimensions of her professional life in mind. She put the mug down. Her phone rang. It was a number she didn't have saved. She let it go to voicemail. 30 seconds later, the voicemail notification came through and she played it. The voice on the recording wasn't Preston. It was a woman. Older, careful, the particular vocal quality of someone accustomed to institutional settings. Ms. Whitlock, this is Deputy Director Harmon, with the Office of Professional Responsibility. We've received a referral from the Bar Association in connection with a complaint filed yesterday. Given the nature of the referral, we'd like to schedule a voluntary interview at your earliest convenience. Please return this call at. She stopped the message. Office of Professional Responsibility. Federal jurisdiction. She sat very still. The bar complaint had been filed at 4:07. The OPR referral, which required the Bar Association to have reviewed and forwarded the complaint as warranting federal attention, had been filed, processed, and resulted in a call to her before 7:30 the following morning. That was not standard processing time. That was not a complaint that had been received, reviewed, and escalated through normal channels. That was a complaint that had arrived prepackaged with a referral recommendation, already attached a document designed not just to trigger the Bar Association's process, but to immediately escalate it to a level where the jurisdictional weight was significantly heavier. Preston Caldwell had federal contacts. Of course he did. He was a man with a Senate campaign and a political network that had been 3 years in construction. He had relationships with people in offices that processed things faster for people who mattered to them. She picked up her phone and called Dorian. He answered immediately. She had a brief, disconnected thought that he probably hadn't slept either. He has an OPR contact, she said. The referral came through overnight. They've already called. A pause. Short. Don't return that call without Sandra present. I know. She pressed her fingers against her mouth for a moment. Dorian. This is federal now. Yes. Which means whatever you've been holding the campaign finance material if you're going to use it, the windows. I know what the window is. How long do you need? Less time than you think. She breathed through her nose. What does that mean? It means I've been in contact with someone at the Campaign Finance Commission for the last 6 hours, he said. The referral is already in motion. She went very still. You filed a referral, she said, to the Campaign Finance Commission. Last night, at 12:40 a.m., before the OPR called me. Yes. You didn't tell me. You were working on your response document. I didn't want to, Dorian. The single word had weight in it. Not anger, exactly. Something more complicated than anger. Stop deciding what information I need and when I need it. Stop managing what I know about my own situation. The silence on the line was different from his other silences. Thinner. You're right, he said. I keep being right about things that shouldn't require me to be right about them. Yes. She stood up from the table and walked to her window. The city was starting its morning, outside gray light, early traffic, the particular sound of a place that doesn't pause for individual situations, regardless of their scale. What's in the referral, she said. Undisclosed funding sources totaling approximately $3.7 million across the last 18 months of campaign activity. 12 transactions routed through 3 separate intermediaries that don't appear in any public filing. That she absorbed it, that's not a minor compliance issue. No, it's not. What happens when that moves? The commission opens an investigation. Typically, they request records within 10 business days. If the investigation moves to the enforcement division, his campaign freezes, at minimum, and his political relationships become complicated, Dorian said. The people who expedited the OPR referral for him will have a strong incentive to create distance. Quickly, she understood what he was telling her. The federal contacts who had processed Preston's referral overnight would not want to be adjacent to a candidate under federal investigation. The OPR call to her had come from Preston's influence. That influence was, as of 12:40 this morning, operating on borrowed time. He's going to know it was you, she said. Yes, and he'll come at you. He'll try. Dorian's voice was absolutely even. He's been trying in various capacities for about 3 years. He's not particularly good at it. She pressed her forehead briefly against the cool glass of the window. Outside, a cab pulled over. A woman got in without looking up from her phone. Cab pulled back into traffic. Everything continued. There's something else, Dorian said. She didn't move. Say it. The man in the conference room last night. Jonathan Price, the insurance carrier representative. He's not with the insurance carrier, Dorian said. I had him checked last night after you left. He's a private investigator. His firm specializes in gathering information during litigation proceedings under the cover of institutional representation. She lifted her head from the glass. He was there to watch me, she said, and to document the conversation. His firm uses concealed recording equipment as standard practice in intake visits. Her voice went very flat. There's a recording of last night's conference room conversation. Potentially, yes, which includes everything you told me about the environmental documentation and the Cayman transfers. Yes, which Preston now has. Potentially. She turned away from the window. She felt moving through her something she hadn't quite felt yet in all of this, not fear, not anger, not the particular cold clarity that had been carrying her through the last 18 hours. Something rawer than any of those. Something closer to the feeling of standing in a burning building and understanding for the first time that the fire started before you arrived. Everything she had walked into last night had been observed. Her conversation with Dorian, his disclosure of what he knew, his reference to campaign finance material, all of it, potentially on a recording that was currently in the possession of Preston Caldwell's team. And if that recording existed, if they had Dorian's voice describing federal-level material he'd obtained through methods he'd declined to specify then, the filing that had already gone to the campaign. Finance Commission was not a weapon in her defense. It was evidence of something that could be used against him. She sat down on the floor of her apartment with her back against the wall because the chair felt too far away, and her legs had made a unilateral decision. He set a trap inside the trap, she said. Dorian was quiet. The engagement was the first layer, she said. The complaint was the second. Price in the conference room was the third. He wanted you to disclose what you had. He wanted you on record, describing how you obtained federal-level information about his campaign financing. and I walked us both directly into it. The silence stretched. Evelyn, don't. She pressed the back of her head against the wall. Don't tell me it's not my fault. I know whose fault it is. I'm trying to understand the full structure of what we're inside. She heard him breathe. We're inside a situation designed by someone who has been preparing it for approximately 3 years, Dorian said quietly. He identified you as a point of access, and he built a scenario that could be used against me through you. The engagement was never about political image. It was about getting close enough to use you as leverage. She absorbed that. The engagement had never been about his campaign. It had been about Dorian. Preston Caldwell had spent 3 years trying to find an angle on the most carefully protected man in the city, and he had found it not in business or territory or professional exposure, but in a woman who worked for him, a woman whose desperation had made her reachable, whose integrity had made her believable, and whose proximity to Dorian Blackthorne had made her, in Preston's calculation, the perfect instrument for a trap that had taken years to build and 30 seconds to spring. She had not been the target. She had been the mechanism. The navy dress in the garment bag in her office. The ring she'd put in her coat pocket. The gala 3 weeks away that was never a gala, it was a stage, and she was never the star of it. She had been the prop. Her jaw was very tight. She breathed. How much did he get, she said, on the recording. Specifically, I don't know the exact content yet. My people are working on it. Best guess, enough, Dorian said. Enough to complicate the campaign finance referral. Enough to raise questions about the methods behind the documentation. Can the referral be withdrawn? Withdrawing it after submission raises its own flags. So we can't pull it back, and we can't let it move forward without potentially exposing how you got the material. That's the current position, yes. She looked at the ceiling of her apartment. At the water stain near the light fixture she'd been meaning to have looked at for 8 months. At the ordinary, specific details of a life that had been, until approximately 40 hours ago, proceeding with reasonable predictability. She thought about what Sandra had said. This isn't about your conduct. It's about pressure. Preston hadn't filed the complaint to disbar her. He'd filed it to put her in a room with Dorian, to create a crisis that would require Dorian to respond, to engineer a conversation that could be recorded and then used to undermine the very filing that was designed to protect her. It was, she thought, with the particular bitter clarity of someone examining the dimensions of a trap from the inside, genuinely impressive. What do we do, she said. Dorian was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was different from any register she'd heard from him, yet not controlled exactly, but deliberate in a way that carried its own weight. I'm going to make a call, he said, to a federal prosecutor I have a relationship with, not to interfere with the commission referral, to supplement it, to provide a context for how the documentation was obtained that preempts the argument Preston's team will make about the methods. You're going to get ahead of it. I'm going to define it before he does. And if that call exposes you to something, a pause. Then it exposes me, he said. That's where we are. She sat on the floor of her apartment and held the phone and listened to the sound of a man she had spent 4 years maintaining careful professional distance from, telling her, in the flattest and most direct terms available to him, that he was willing to walk into federal exposure to get her out of a trap she'd walked into, partly because of his own miscalculations. Dorian. Her voice came out quieter than she'd intended. You should have told me all of this from the beginning. Yes, he said, I should have. Why didn't you? The silence this time was the longest yet. Silent 'cause telling you the truth about Preston from the beginning meant telling you the truth about why I was paying attention to Preston in the first place, he said. And I wasn't ready for that conversation. She closed her eyes. She understood exactly what he meant. He hadn't been watching Preston Caldwell because of business overlap. He had been watching Preston Caldwell because Preston Caldwell had gotten close to Evelyn. And Dorian Blackthorne, who had spent 4 years constructing professional distance between himself and the sincere person in his orbit he could not afford to be careless about, had responded to that proximity with the only tool he had fully developed, surveillance and control, and the accumulation of leverage, because love, for a man like Dorian, did not come out naturally as tenderness. Came out as protection, even when the protection was clumsy. Even when it arrived too late. Even when the thing he was protecting her from had already, by the time he understood the full shape of it, become a trap they were both standing inside. "Make your call," she said. "All right. And then we need to talk. Not about strategy, not about documentation or referrals or bar complaints. About the rest of it." "Yes," he said. "We do." She hung up. She sat on the floor of her apartment for another 3 minutes. Then she stood up, straightened her jacket, picked up her phone and her bag, and walked to the door. Whatever was coming next, she was not going to face it sitting on the floor. She was in the elevator when her phone lit up with a text from Sandra. "Committee moved the interview to 10 a.m. Fitch wants both of us there. Price will also be present, apparently. He's been retained as an independent observer by the committee." "Evelyn, that's not standard." She read it twice. The elevator opened on the lobby. She walked out into the gray morning air and stood on the sidewalk. For a moment, people moving past her in both directions. A sound like green wood splitting, and she thought about Jonathan Price, sitting in that conference room last night, with his jacket and his careful expression, and whatever was concealed inside the equipment he'd brought with him. The committee had retained him. Preston hadn't just planted Price in Dorian's conference room. He'd gotten Price embedded in the review process itself. The man who had potentially recorded her conversation with Dorian's last night would now be sitting in the same room when she made her formal response to the complaint he'd helped engineer. She called Sandra back. "I saw it," she said, when Sandra picked up. "Tell me about Price, everything you know." Evelyn walked as she talked. She covered half a block before she'd finished the summary, the conference room, the insurance carrier misrepresentation, Dorian's confirmation of the recording concern, the specific timing of Price's appearance relative to the complaint filing. Sandra was quiet for 4 seconds after she finished. "He's not an observer. He's a witness they're positioning inside the process." "Yes, if he has a recording from last night."
"I know."
"Evelyn, if that recording shows Dorian Blackthorne describing how he obtained campaign finance documentation and referencing methods he won't specify, and that recording gets played in the committee hearing this morning." "I know, Sandra. The response document you prepared becomes secondary. Everything becomes secondary." "I know." She stopped walking. She was standing at the corner of 2 streets she passed every working morning of her life, and the familiar geography of it felt, in this particular moment, deeply strange. "What do I do?" "You come in. You sit down, and you let me handle the first 40 minutes. Sandra's voice had gone into its professional register, the one that meant she'd already assessed the terrain and was moving. "Don't volunteer anything about the conference room conversation. Don't reference the Aldrin documentation unless I introduce it first. And do not, Evelyn, I need you to hear this clearly. Do not say Dorian Blackthorne's name in that room unless you are directly asked. They'll ask. Let them ask. And when they do, you answer exactly what was asked and nothing adjacent to it. All right, one more thing." A pause. "Does Blackthorne know about Price's role in the committee?" "Not yet. Tell him now, before 10. She hung up and called Dorian. He answered in one ring. "I know," he said. "Marcus just flagged it. Price is inside the process." "Yes. Did you make the call?" "To the federal prosecutor. At 6:15 this morning." And the conversation happened. The context has been established. Whether it's sufficient depends on what Price has and how he uses it. His voice was flat and moving fast, which was the closest Dorian Blackthorne came to urgency. "There's another development." She kept walking. She didn't know where she was going. "Forward, mostly. Say it. Preston is holding a press event at 9 o'clock. Outside City Hall. He's announcing the engagement is over his framing, his narrative. His communications team sent the release at 6 a.m. She stopped again. "He's going public before the hearing. He's controlling the story before you have a chance to establish yours." She pressed her free hand against her sternum and breathed once, deliberately. "What does the release say?" "That the engagement was terminated due to irreconcilable differences in values and professional conduct. He expresses regret. He references his continued commitment to the community. A beat. He also notes, without naming you specifically, that he has been forced to take legal action to protect the integrity of agreements made in good faith. He'd filed something else, something beyond the bar complaint. "What legal action?" she said. "His attorneys filed the cancellation penalty claim this morning. Civil suit, 200,000 in liquidated damages plus attorney fees. It's in the court system as of 7 a.m. She was moving again. She needed to keep moving. He's litigating the cancellation clause and going to the press about it simultaneously. By the time the committee hearing starts, the press event will have run. Any reporter covering the hearing will have his framing already in their notes." She thought about Marianne Whitlock at home, recovering, watching the morning news with the television too loud the way she always did. She thought about her mother seeing her daughter's name attached to a story about a broken engagement and a civil suit and a bar complaint. The particular fear that landed in her chest was different from everything else she'd felt in the last 24 hours. "I need to call my mother," she said. "Evelyn, 5 minutes." "I need 5 minutes." She turned into a doorway alcove out of the foot traffic. "I will be at the committee at 10. I will do exactly what Sandra tells me to do. But I need 5 minutes first." A pause. "All right. Don't do anything until I'm in that room." "I won't. I mean it. Whatever you're thinking about doing, whatever call you're considering making, whatever move you have ready, hold it until I'm sitting at that table." "Evelyn," his voice was quiet. "I'll hold." She hung up and called her mother. Marianne Whitlock answered on the second ring, with the voice of a woman who had already seen the morning news. "Baby," she said. Just that, just the one word, in the tone that had been Evelyn's entire definition of the word home for her entire life. "I'm all right," Evelyn said. Her voice cracked slightly on the second word and she resaid it. "I need you to know that first. I'm all right. I saw his press thing." "I know, he's lying." "Yes, all of it's lying." Zur's voice had shifted from the maternal worry to something harder underneath it, the specific quality of a woman who had raised a daughter alone and survived everything that came with that and was not, in her 60s and in remission from lymphoma, going to be frightened by a politician with good hair. "You know what he reminds me of? Your father." Evelyn closed her eyes for a second. "Mom, same smile, same way of talking about himself in the third person, like his reputation is a separate person he's responsible for." A pause. "You didn't do anything wrong." "I know. Do you?" She leaned her head back against the alcove wall. "I walked into something I should have seen more clearly." "You tried to save my life," Marianne said. Her voice was even and direct in the way it always was when she was saying something she'd already decided to say. "Don't you dress that up as a failure. Don't you dare." Evelyn pressed her mouth together for a moment. "I have a hearing at 10. Go, I'll call you after. You better a beat." "Evelyn, yeah. Whoever paid for my treatments." She went still. "I don't know who that was," her mother said carefully. "And you don't have to tell me. But whoever it was, they did it without asking for anything back. In my experience, that's not nothing." She couldn't speak for a moment. "Go to your hearing," Marianne said, "and then we'll talk." She hung up. She stood in the alcove for another 60 seconds, letting her pulse settle, letting the specific pressure behind her eyes do whatever it needed to do before she walked back out into the morning and became again the version of herself that was going to need to be very sharp in approximately 2 hours. Then she walked out. The Bar Association's Professional Conduct Committee met in a building 4 blocks from the courthouse, a place Evelyn had been in twice before on behalf of clients, never on behalf of herself. The waiting area had the specific quality of institutional spaces designed to communicate seriousness without being openly threatening. Gray carpet, framed credentials on the walls, chairs that were functional but not comfortable. Sandra Park was already there when Evelyn arrived at 9:40. Sandra was 51, Korean American, and had the kind of compact professional authority that made rooms rearrange themselves without fanfare. She had her briefcase open on the chair beside her and was reading something on a tablet with the focused attention of someone finishing final preparation. She looked up when Evelyn walked in, assessed her in about 2 seconds. "You slept some, a little. Good enough." She closed the tablet. "Price is already inside. He was here when I arrived at 9:15. Of course he was. Fitch is running the panel. 2 additional members, I know one of them. She's fair. The other is newer, which means he'll be more deferential to Fitch's red. Sandra stood, straightened her jacket. The structure is going to be, they present the complaint's specific allegations. We respond to each in order, and then they open to questions. Price will be seated to the side as an independent observer. Theoretically, he speaks only if invited. In practice, Fitch may invite him to speak, and if he plays a recording, Sandra's expression didn't change. Then we deal with it when it happens. Right now, it's evidence he may or may not have, and we don't confirm or deny the conference room conversation unless it comes up. It'll come up probably. Let it come from them. She looked at Evelyn steadily. You're very good at depositions. Think of this as a deposition where you're the witness. Answer what's asked. Don't fill silence. I know how to do this. I know you do. I'm reminding you because it's different when it's your license on the line. A beat. Ready? Evelyn straightened. Yes. They went in. The committee room was smaller than she'd expected and more crowded. Fitch sat at the center of a long table with 2 other committee members flanking him. A stenographer was positioned to one side. Price sat in a chair against the wall, not at the table, but close enough. He had a leather portfolio on his knee and a neutral expression that she read, now that she knew what she was looking at, as the practiced blankness of someone who is recording and does not want to appear to be. She sat across from the committee. Sandra sat beside her. Fitch opened without preamble. Ms. Whitlock, thank you for coming in on short notice. This proceeding is recorded for the committee's records. You're not under oath in a legal sense, but statements made here carry professional weight and will be included in the investigation file. Do you understand? Yes. The complaint filed yesterday by Mr. Preston Caldwell's legal representatives contains 3 primary allegations. He opened a folder. First, that your professional conduct in your role as legal counsel to Dorian Blackthorne constitutes a pattern of facilitation of business activities with known legal exposure. Second, that you disclosed privileged or confidential information obtained through your professional position during a meeting with Mr. Caldwell on the afternoon of the complaint date. Third, that the totality of your professional conduct represents a sustained conflict of interest that has compromised your fitness to practice. He looked up. Miss Park, does your client wish to respond? She does, Sandra said, and we have documentation to support each response. For the next 35 minutes, Sandra moved through the complaint with the efficient precision of someone who had been doing this for 20 years. The permit documentation was presented as publicly sourced and verifiable. The Aldrin Medical Initiative transfer records were entered into the proceeding with a sourcing statement that Sandra had drafted, carefully connecting the foundation to Dorian's holdings without characterizing the connection in ways that could be used adversarially. The response to the conflict of interest allegation was built on 4 years of documented professional conduct with a record that contained no prior complaints and no disciplinary history. The committee asked questions. Evelyn answered them directly and exactly as Sandra had coached. She felt, through most of it, the specific operational calm of someone who is performing a high-stakes task they have prepared thoroughly for present in the room, focused on each question, not allowing herself to think about what was still pending. Then Fitch turned to Price. Mr. Price, do you have anything to add to the committee's understanding of the evidence base? Price uncrossed his legs, opened his portfolio. Yes, I do. He removed a printed document and set it on the table in front of Fitch without getting up. One of the committee staff carried it to the table. Fitch looked at it. His expression shifted not dramatically, but enough. This is a transcript, Fitch said. A partial transcript, Price said. Derived from an audio recording made during a meeting that took place yesterday evening in the offices of Blackthorne Holdings. The recording captures a conversation between Miss Whitlock and Mr. Blackthorne in which Mr. Blackthorne describes the origins of certain documentation, including materials characterized as relating to federal campaign finance violations. Evelyn kept her hands flat on the table. Sandra's pen stopped moving. The recording is relevant, Price continued, to the question of whether Ms. Whitlock's access to and use of information obtained through her professional relationship with Mr. Blackthorne constitutes the kind of conduct the complaint characterizes. Specifically, the transcript shows Ms. Whitlock receiving disclosure of how documentation was obtained. "How was that recording made?" Sandra said. Her voice was sharp and clean. Price looked at her. "The recording was made pursuant to an authorized investigation into the professional conduct of—" "That is not what I asked." Sandra's tone didn't rise. Compressed. "How was that recording? Made by whom? Under what authorization? In what capacity?" Fitch held up a hand. "Mr. Price, please specify the authorization basis for this recording." A beat. The first genuine pause Price had shown since the proceeding started. "My firm was retained by the complainant to document evidence relevant to the complaint." "You were retained by Preston Caldwell," Sandra said. "By his legal representatives, yes. And you attended the meeting at Blackthorne Holdings last evening. In what capacity?" "You were introduced as a representative of the firm's insurance carrier." The room went quiet in a specific way. Fitch looked at Price. Price looked at Sandra. Your introduction was a misrepresentation of your identity and purpose," Sandra said. "You entered a private professional meeting under a false pretense, during which you made a recording without the consent of the parties present. In this state, recording a private conversation without the consent of all parties is a violation of two-party consent law. The recording is inadmissible in any legal proceeding, and its procurement constitutes a potential criminal violation." She let that land. Then she looked at Fitch. "The committee should also be aware that the recording, having been obtained through deception in the offices of an ongoing legal representation, may constitute unauthorized access to privileged attorney-client communications. Introducing it into this proceeding would expose the committee to a significant procedural challenge." Fitch set the transcript down. He looked at it for a moment. Then at Price. Then at Sandra. "Mr. Price," he said, "I'm going to ask you to step out while the committee addresses this question." Price's jaw was tight. He gathered his portfolio and stood. He walked past Evelyn's chair on the way to the door. She didn't look at him. She was too busy managing her breathing to look at anything that wasn't the middle distance. The committee recessed for 11 minutes. Evelyn and Sandra sat in the waiting area while Evelyn drank water from a plastic cup and Sandra made 2 phone calls she conducted in a low, rapid voice that Evelyn couldn't fully follow, but that had the cadence of someone establishing positions quickly. When they were called back in, Fitch had a different expression than he'd entered the morning with. "The committee has determined that the recording and the associated transcript cannot be entered into evidence in this proceeding," he said. "The procurement method raises sufficient procedural and legal concerns to preclude its use. We have also determined that Mr. Price's role in this proceeding involves a conflict of interest that disqualifies him from serving as an independent observer." Sandra nodded once precisely. "On the basis of the documentation provided and the committee's review of Miss Whitlock's professional record," Fitch continued, "we are suspending the expedited review process. The complaint will proceed through standard channels, which carry a substantially longer timeline and a different evidentiary standard. Ms. Whitlock, your practice authorization is not suspended pending this review." He paused. "The standard process typically takes 8 to 12 months. You are free to continue practicing during that period." Evelyn exhaled, not dramatically, just once quietly through her nose. "Thank you," Sandra said. They stood. They shook hands with the committee members. They walked out into the hallway. Sandra waited until the door closed behind them. Then she leaned against the wall, tilted her head back, and said, "Price." "Yeah." He walked into a 2-party consent state with an illegal recording and tried to submit it in a formal proceeding. Preston was counting on the committee not pushing back on the authorization question, Evelyn said. He expected the recording to move fast enough that the consent issues wouldn't get raised until after it had done its damage. He miscalculated. He's been miscalculating since yesterday afternoon. She picked up her bag. He's going to escalate. Yes, Sandra straightened. Which is why you need to think about what you have and how you use it. The civil suit is still live. The cancellation penalties are still on the table. I know, Evelyn. Sandra looked at her directly. You have a client who has federal campaign finance documentation on the man suing you. That documentation is already in motion with the commission. Question is whether the civil suit stays, live long enough to cause damage before the federal process creates sufficient pressure to make it disappear. How long does the civil suit take to cause damage? In practical terms, the filing is already public, already in press coverage. His framing from this morning's press event is already out there. She paused. The damage from the suit isn't the judgment. It's the narrative while the process runs. She understood. The civil suit was designed to keep her name attached to a story about broken agreements and professional conduct questions for as long as possible through the campaign season, through any coverage of Preston's political activities, through every professional event and public appearance she made in the next 12 to 18 months. She pulled out her phone. She had 3 missed calls from a number she didn't know, and 1 text from Marcus Webb that said simply, "Conference room. When you're out." She showed it to Sandra. Sandra read it. "Go. You're not coming? You don't need me for whatever that is." She picked up her briefcase. "Call me when you know what the next move is." Evelyn walked out of the building and into the late morning with the specific quality of a person who has just survived one thing and is already looking at the shape of the next. Marcus was waiting in the lobby of Blackthorn Tower when she arrived. He put her in the elevator without speaking and rode up with her and walked her to the conference room and opened the door. Dorian was there. So was a woman Evelyn didn't recognize, late 40s, dark suit, the specific bearing of someone accustomed to institutional authority. She had a federal ID clipped to her jacket lapel. "Evelyn Whitlock," Dorian said. "This is Deputy Assistant Director Claire Okafor. She's with the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Public Corruption Unit." Evelyn sat down. She looked at Okafor. "You're not from the Campaign Finance Commission?" "No." Okafor's voice was level and direct. "The referral filed with the commission last night flagged a pattern that overlaps with an existing investigation our unit has been running for 14 months. The commission forwarded the material to us this morning." She paused. "We've been looking at Preston Caldwell's development network. Your referral," she looked at Dorian, "briefly provided documentation that fills several gaps in our existing case file." Evelyn looked at Dorian. He held her gaze. 14 months, she said. "The FBI has been investigating Preston independently," Dorian said. "I didn't know the extent of it until this morning." She looked back at Okafor. "What does this mean for the civil suit?" "That's outside our jurisdiction. What's inside our jurisdiction is the question of whether Mr. Caldwell's development activities, his campaign financing, and potentially his engagement agreement with you constitute a pattern of conduct we're interested in examining." Okafor folded her hands on the table. "Ms. Whitlock, we'd like to speak with you formally. As a witness." "When?" "Today, if possible." She breathed. "I need my attorney present, of course." Picked up her phone and called Sandra. Sandra said, without hesitation, "I'll be there in 20 minutes." While they waited, the room was quiet. Okafor reviewed documents. Marcus stood by the door. Dorian sat at the end of the table and said nothing and looked at the window, and Evelyn sat in the middle of it all and thought about 14 months. About a federal investigation that had been running for more than a year. About the fact that Preston Caldwell had spent 3 years building a trap for Dorian, while the federal government had been quietly disassembling his own foundation from the other direction. She looked at Dorian. "Did you know they were investigating him?" "I suspected. I didn't have confirmation." "When did you suspect?" "About a year ago." She held his gaze. "And you've been watching him for 3 years." "Yes." "So for approximately 1 year, you have suspected that a man you were watching, Han, was also being watched federally, and you did not—" She stopped herself. A sound like green wood splitting. This was not the moment conversation. She could see from his expression that he knew it wasn't the moment either, and that he was not going to avoid it when the moment came. "No," he said. "I didn't." She looked back at the table. Sandra arrived at 18 minutes. She took one look at Okafor's ID and sat down beside Evelyn with the expression of someone who has just been handed a situation that is significantly larger than the one they left 40 minutes ago. "Deputy Assistant Director," she said. Before we begin, my client's cooperation is contingent on a clear understanding of her status in this matter. Witness, Okafor said, not subject. That's documented. And the civil suit filed this morning by Caldwell's representatives. Okafor's expression shifted very slightly. I can't speak to civil proceedings directly. What I can tell you is that civil suits filed by subjects of active federal public corruption investigations tend to, she paused, resolve. Sandra looked at Evelyn. Evelyn looked at Okafor. Ask your question, she said. The interview took 2 hours and 40 minutes. Okafor asked about the engagement agreement, the payment structure, the bar complaint, and the conference room meeting with Price. She asked about specific conversations with Preston, specific dates, specific representations he had made about the medical payment. She asked about Evelyn's professional relationship with Dorian in terms that were precise and respectful, and gave no indication of the kind of prosecutorial shading that would have suggested Evelyn's status had shifted. Evelyn answered everything. Sandra didn't stop her from answering. She answered carefully and specifically and without embellishment, which was the only way she knew how to answer questions under formal conditions. At one point, Okafor asked about the dress. She looked up. I'm sorry, the engagement gala. There was a dress. Specific garment bag that was delivered to your office. Okafor was reading from a document. We have surveillance footage from the building's lobby system from the evening prior to the complaint being filed. It shows you in the office late. It shows Mr. Blackthorne arriving after hours. The dress appears to be relevant to the timeline. Evelyn thought about standing in front of the mirror in navy silk, about what she'd seen in that mirror, about the footsteps she'd heard, before she'd processed who they belonged to. The dress was provided by Caldwell's events team, she said. For the gala, I tried it on in the office, and Mr. Blackthorne arrived while you were trying it on. Yes. What was discussed? She looked at Okafor. She said, he told me the truth about the payment, about my mother's treatment. That's when I found out the money hadn't come from Caldwell. Okafor wrote something, and that conversation was the beginning of the sequence that led to your confrontation with Caldwell the following day. Yes, and to the bar complaint. Yes. Okafor looked up from her notes. Ms. Whitlock, the dress. Did you ever wear it? To the gala or otherwise? She held the agent's gaze. No, she said, I didn't. Okafor nodded once. She made another note. She moved to the next question. By the time it was over, the afternoon had moved into early evening, without Evelyn noticing. The light through the conference room windows had shifted from flat gray to the specific amber of late afternoon sun, cutting between buildings. Okafor closed her folder. Thank you for your cooperation, Ms. Whitlock. We'll be in contact if we need anything further. What's the timeline? Sandra said. I can't give you specifics on an ongoing investigation. She stood. What I can tell you is that we're moving. She left with her assistant, and the door closed, and the room went quiet. Sandra turned to Evelyn. You understand what just happened. Federal public corruption investigation. Active. Our referral plugged gaps in their existing case. They had 14 months of groundwork. We handed them the financing documentation. They were already close. She paused. This moves fast now. Federal investigations at this stage move fast. The civil suit. Watch it. Sandra picked up her briefcase. I'd be surprised if his attorneys don't file for withdrawal within the week. She left. And then it was just Evelyn and Dorian in the conference room again, which was where it kept coming back to. He was still at the end of the table. He hadn't moved much in the last 3 hours. He had the look of someone who had been very still on purpose for a sustained period of time. The call you made, she said, to the federal prosecutor. That's what triggered the FBI referral. The prosecutor is a former colleague of Okafor's, Dorian said. He made an inquiry. She recognized the overlap with her existing case. You didn't plan that. No. I knew the campaign finance referral would create pressure. I didn't know the FBI had 14 months of prior work. She looked at him. Honest answer, yes. How often do you give those? He held her gaze. More than you've given me credit for. Less than you deserved. She was tired. She was more tired than she'd been since the night she'd sat up calculating numbers that didn't add up, trying to find a way to save her mother's life. The specific bone-deep exhaustion of someone who has been operating at maximum capacity for 36 continuous hours on insufficient sleep and insufficient information, and the particular weight of a situation that kept revealing new floors beneath the floors she'd already found. She looked at Dorian Blackthorne, at the man who had paid anonymously for her mother's treatment, and said nothing. Who had watched Preston Caldwell move toward her and miscalculated the speed. Who had walked into federal exposure to supplement a referral. Who had been sitting in a conference room for 3 hours while federal agents interviewed the woman he'd spent 4 years refusing to tell the truth to. "The thing you said last night," she said, "about why you didn't tell me sooner. About not being ready for the conversation. Yes. I need you to be ready for it now." He looked at her steadily. Something in his face, the controlled surface of it, shifted. Not dramatically. Not the kind of shift that announces itself. The kind that happens when something a person has been holding for a long time finally gets set down. "I know," he said. She waited. He put both hands flat on the table and looked at them for a moment, and then looked at her. "I have been in love with you," he said, "for 2 years and 4 months. I know the exact date I understood it, because it was the date I decided I was never going to act on it, and the decision and the understanding arrived at the same time." He paused. "That's not a story with a clean explanation. It's just what happened." The room was very quiet. 2 years and 4 months, she said. "Yes. And in 2 years and 4 months, you decided. I decided that I was not going to use what I felt to make you feel that you owed me something. I was not going to use my position. I was not going to use the foundation. I was not going to use anything I had to make you choose me." He held her gaze. "I've watched people use love as a mechanism my entire adult life. I know what it produces. I wasn't going to do that to you." She thought about the dress in the garment bag, about the mirror and what she'd seen in it, about a man who walked through a door at 9 o'clock at night and said 3 words that had been building in him for over 2 years. "And Preston," she said. "Preston was never about politics." His voice went flat. "He got to you because I'd spent 2 years making sure I wasn't close enough to see him coming." She breathed. "That's the part that's your fault," she said. "Yes. Not all of it. But that part. Yes." He didn't flinch from it. "That part is mine." She stood up. She walked to the window. The city was still out there, doing what it always did, entirely indifferent to everything that had happened in this room and the rooms adjacent to it in the last 36 hours. She pressed her palm flat against the glass and felt the cold of it. "I need to go home," she said. "I need to sleep for approximately 12 hours. And then I need to see my mother." She paused. "And then I need to figure out who I am on the other side of all of this. Because I'm not entirely sure I know yet." She heard him stand. She didn't turn around. "Evelyn." "Not tonight, Dorian." Her voice was quiet. "I'm not saying no. I'm saying I need tonight to just be tonight, before anything else gets decided." Pause. Long enough to contain the weight of 2 years and 4 months. "All right," he said. She picked up her coat and her bag. She walked to the door. She stopped with her hand on the frame, the same frame again, and she thought about how many times in the last 3 days she'd stood in a doorway, trying to figure out what came next. She thought about her mother's voice on the phone that morning. Whoever it was, they did it without asking for anything back. Turned around. Dorian was still standing at the table. He looked at her with the particular expression of a man who has said everything he can say and is now simply present. "The dress," she said. "What about it?" "I'm going to return it." She held his gaze. "I don't need it anymore." Something crossed his face. She turned back to the door. "Don't do anything while I'm gone," she said. "Whatever else is in motion, the federal process, the civil suit, whatever Preston moves next, hold it." "For how long?" She opened the door. "Until morning," she said. And she walked out into the hallway, and into the elevator, and out through the lobby, into the evening, and the city received her, the way cities always do, without ceremony, without acknowledgement, without any particular interest in the fact that everything had just changed. Preston Caldwell still had his civil suit and his press narrative, and whatever moves remained to him. The federal investigation was moving, but federal investigations moved on their own timeline, regardless of what anyone needed from them. The bar complaint was still in the system. The dress was still in the garment bag in her office. Nothing was over. But for the first time in 36 hours, she could see the edges of the thing she was inside, could see that it had edges, that it was finite, that there was a shape to it, and she was beginning to understand the shape. She walked home. The evening air was cold and smelled like the city, and she breathed it and kept walking. And somewhere behind her in a tower, 43 floors up, a man who had loved her in silence for 2 years and 4 months watched the window and held. And 3 blocks away, in her office garment bag, a navy silk dress hung in the dark unworn, waiting to be returned to the man who had never deserved to put it on her in the first place. She slept for 11 hours. Not peacefully asleep after that kind of sustained pressure rarely is. She woke twice, once at 2 in the morning, with her heart going too fast for no reason she could identify, and once at 4:30 when a car alarm on the street below ran for 90 seconds before stopping. But she slept, and when she finally came fully awake at 7:15, with gray morning light coming through the curtains she hadn't fully closed, there was something different in the quality of the day. Not better exactly, not resolved, but different in the way the air is different after a storm has finished, still heavy, still carrying the evidence of what it has just done, but no longer in the act of doing it. She lay still for a moment and took stock. The federal investigation was running. The bar complaint was in standard process, which meant 12 months minimum and no suspension. The civil suit was live. Preston Caldwell was still out there with his press narrative and his remaining resources and whatever moves he had left. Dorian Blackthorne was 43 floors up in a building 12 blocks away, having said 2 years and 4 months, having said I know the exact date. She got up. She made coffee. She stood at her kitchen window and drank it and watched the street below where ordinary morning things were happening. A woman walking a dog. A delivery truck double-parked. 2 men in construction vests moving with the particular unhurried purpose of people who have a long day ahead of them and know it. She called her mother at 7:45. Marianne Whitlock answered on the first ring, which meant she'd been awake for a while. "How do you feel?" her mother said. "Like I slept 11 hours. "That's not an answer, I know." Evelyn looked at the street. "I feel like I'm standing on the other side of something. I'm not entirely sure what the other side looks like yet." Her mother was quiet for a moment. "You coming today?" "Yes, after I handle a few things. Bring food. Something real, not that salad situation you brought last time." Despite everything, she smiled. "Okay. And Evelyn?" "Yeah. Last night I looked up that foundation. The Aldrin thing. It's been in the news this morning, something about a federal investigation. Caldwell's name attached to it." A pause. "The foundation funded 12 other families last year. The website's old and plain, and there's no donor name anywhere on it." Evelyn said nothing. "Whoever set that up," Marianne said, "set it up so nobody would ever know who to thank. That's a particular kind of person." "I know." "Does he know that I know?" "Not yet." "All right." Her mother's voice settled. "Come when you're ready. I'll be here." She hung up and stood with the empty coffee mug and thought about what kind of person builds something specifically so that no one ever knows to thank them, and what that costs over time, and what it means about the person who built it. Then she put the mug in the sink and got dressed and went to handle the few things. The first thing was the garment bag. She picked it up from her office, where it had been hanging on the back of the door since the night she'd put it back in its bag and gone home and had the conversation that changed everything. The dress inside it was still navy, still silk, still beautiful, in the way expensive things made for specific purposes tend to be. Carried it out of the building without ceremony and took a cab to Preston's building. She didn't go up. She gave the bag to the lobby attendant with Preston's name on a card and a note that said only returned. No alterations needed. She stood on the sidewalk outside for a moment after. The building was glass and steel, and about 40% of its lobby was visible from the street, the kind of architectural transparency that was designed to communicate openness while actually communicating impenetrability. She'd walked through those doors 2 days ago, with a ring in her pocket and a plan that she'd believed was solid, and the plan had been solid in the ways that plans built on incomplete information tend to be solid right up to the moment it wasn't. She thought about what Sandra had said. The damage from the suit isn't the judgment. It's the narrative while the process runs. She thought about Preston at his press event yesterday morning. Practiced regret. The third-person relationship with his own reputation. She thought about what her mother had said about her father. Same smile. She turned and walked away. The second thing was harder. Sandra called at 9:15 with an update that Evelyn had been half expecting and half dreading in equal measure. Preston's attorneys had filed a motion to expedite the civil suit, which was aggressive and procedurally unusual, and would require a response within 10 days. Sandra's read was that the motion was designed to force a settlement conversation before a federal investigation created enough pressure to make the suit untenable that Preston's legal team understood. The window for leverage was closing and was trying to extract something before it shut. He wants money, Sandra said, or a public statement. Something that lets him say the engagement dissolved for mutual reasons rather than because he committed fraud. He's not getting either, I know. I'm just telling you the strategy. A pause. The motion will be denied. The procedural basis is weak. But the filing creates another news cycle. Let it. Evelyn, let it run. She was walking as she talked, moving through the city the way she'd been moving through the city for 3 days forward. Mostly because forward was the only direction that led anywhere. His narrative has a shelf life. The federal investigation doesn't. Sandra was quiet for a moment. Okafor called me this morning. She stopped walking, and she can't give me specifics. But she indicated that the pace of the investigation has accelerated. She used the word significantly. She also said that people in Preston's professional network have been cooperative with their inquiry. Cooperative meant his associates were talking. Cooperative meant the people who had facilitated the permit manipulations, who had processed the Cayman transfers, who had expedited the OPR referral. Those people had looked at a federal investigation and made calculations about where their interests lay. How long, Evelyn said. Okafor didn't say. But significantly accelerated plus cooperative usually means months, not years. She stood on the sidewalk and breathed. All right, she said. Tell me what I need to do on the civil suit motion. Sandra told her. It took 8 minutes and involved 3 specific documents Evelyn needed to pull from the original agreement and a timeline of communications that Sandra's office would compile. Evelyn wrote it down in the Notes app on her phone, the way she wrote everything down specifically, completely, without trusting her memory with anything that mattered enough to lose. When Sandra finished, she said one more thing. Say it. Blackthorn's attorneys reached out to my office this morning. He wants to absorb the civil suit, pay the penalties directly, resolve it out of court, and file his own counterclaim against Caldwell on the fraud basis. She closed her eyes briefly. He can't do that. Legally, with the right standing argument, Sandra. She opened her eyes. If Dorian pays the penalties, I spend the next 10 years of my professional life explaining why my employer settled a civil suit on my behalf. That story doesn't go away. It becomes the story. I understand that. Tell his attorneys no. He anticipated that response, Sandra said. He said to tell you he'll hold. She breathed. Of course he did. Evelyn. Sandra's voice carried something personal for the first time in the conversation. Whatever is happening with Blackthorn personally, make sure it doesn't compromise how you navigate the next 60 days. The civil suit, the bar complaint, the federal process, those all need to resolve on their own tracks. I know. He has resources and he's inclined to use them on your behalf. That's not always helpful. I know that too. She paused. I'll handle it. I know you will. A beat. That's actually why I'm not more worried. She hung up and stood on the sidewalk for another moment. Then she turned and walked toward the office because there was work to do, and work, she had learned a long time ago, was one of the few reliable things available to a person when everything else was in the process of either falling apart or reconstituting itself. She worked through the morning with her door open and her phone face up on her desk, which was something she rarely did. She preferred the particular discipline of a closed door and a silenced phone. But today she wanted the noise of the floor. The sound of other people doing ordinary professional things, the specific texture of a workday proceeding normally around her, even while nothing in her own situation was exactly normal yet. At 11:40, Marcus Webb appeared in her doorway. She looked up. "He's in his office," Marcus said. "He wanted you to know he's there." No pressure, just he wanted you to know. She looked at Marcus for a moment. At the man who had been Dorian's operations director for 12 years and who had seen, she suspected, more of Dorian's actual interior life than almost anyone. "Marcus, Ms. Whitlock. Has he ever?" She stopped. Reconsidered. "Is this unusual for him? What's happening?" Marcus was quiet for a moment. He was not a man who chose words carelessly. "In 12 years, he said, I have seen Mr. Blackthorne walk away from more money than most people will earn in 3 lifetimes, when walking away was the right thing. I've seen him absorb losses he didn't have to absorb, because absorbing them was the honorable option." He paused. "I've never seen him want something for himself." She held Marcus's gaze. "Until now," she said. He straightened. "He's in his office." He left. She sat for another 4 minutes. Then she saved her work, stood up, and walked down the hall. Dorian's office was at the corner of the 43rd floor, 2 walls of glass, the city visible in both directions, on a clear day. Today it was mostly clear, high thin clouds, the kind that dilute the light rather than blocking it. He was at his desk when she came in. He looked up. He didn't say anything, and he didn't pretend he hadn't been waiting. She sat in the chair across from his desk. The same chair she'd sat in for 4 years of professional conversations, quarterly reviews, contract discussions, strategy sessions, all the ordinary commerce of a working relationship conducted across this specific geography. "I told Sandra no," she said, "about the civil suit." "I know," she told my attorneys. "You understand why?" "Yes, and you'll hold." He paused. "I don't like it." "I know you don't." She held his gaze. "I need you to hold anyway." He nodded once. She looked at him for a moment. At the man behind the desk, who was both the thing she knew, the controlled, precise, professionally formidable person she had worked beside, lit, for 4 years, and something she was still learning to see clearly. Something she had been choosing not to see clearly, she understood now, for reasons that had made sense at the time, and made less sense the more honestly she examined them. 2 years and 4 months, she said. Yes. What was the date? He held her gaze steadily. March 14th, 3 years ago. You were in the conference room at 11 at night, finishing a contract dispute resolution that should have taken 3 attorneys a full week, and you'd done it in 4 days by yourself. I brought you coffee because you'd been there since 7 in the morning, and I didn't want to send someone else. A pause. You looked up when I put the cup down and said, thank you, without looking at it, because you were still reading. And I stood there for about 20 seconds before I figured out I needed to leave the room. She didn't look away from him. That's a very specific memory. I've had 2 years and 4 months to be specific about it. She breathed once, and you decided that same night. I decided I wasn't going to do anything with it. Yes. Because you worked for me. Because I understood what mixing that kind of power differential with that kind of feeling produces. He paused. I'd seen it produce bad things. In your line of work. In every line of work. His jaw was slightly tight. Power and affection. It doesn't take a criminal organization to make that combination go wrong. It just takes a person who isn't careful. She thought about Preston. About the engagement ring that had felt like a lock. About a dress that had been chosen for her by a stylist she'd never met, for an event that was never what it claimed to be. You were being careful, she said. I was trying to be. Instead, you were absent, at the moment when it mattered. He didn't flinch, yes. That's the thing I need you to understand, she said. Not that you were wrong to keep the distance. I understand why you kept it. I understand the reasoning. But the result of that reasoning, the practical consequence, was that when something moved toward me, you weren't close enough to see it until it was already inside the perimeter. I know, and people I care about got caught in the blast radius. She held his gaze. My mother, my license, 3 days of my life that I would prefer not to repeat. I know that too. She looked at her hands for a moment. At her left hand, where the ring had been. At the bare skin where the platinum setting had sat for weeks. "I'm not angry at you," she said. "I want to be clear about that. I've assessed the anger situation, and what I'm finding is not anger. Something more complicated than anger and less comfortable than forgiveness." She looked up. "I'm finding that I need time to understand what I actually want. Not what I'm choosing because I'm grateful, and not what I'm avoiding because the situation is complicated. What I actually want." Dorian was quiet. "I can work with that," he said. "I don't need you to work with anything. I need you to hear it." "I hear it." She stood up. She walked to the window, his window, the view she'd seen 100 times from the wrong side of his desk, and looked out at the city. "I'm going to see my mother this afternoon," she said. "Okay, and I'm going to keep working here. That's my choice. Not because I owe you that, not because leaving would be easier, because this is my job, and I'm good at it, and I'm not going to let what happened reshape my professional life more than it already has. All right. And whatever we are," she gestured slightly between them. A gesture that covered 2 years and 4 months, and a navy dress, and a bar complaint, and a federal investigation, and a coffee cup set on a table at 11 o'clock at night. "We're going to figure that out slowly. On my timeline, not on yours. Yes. And you're going to tell me things." She turned from the window. "All the things when you know them. Not when you've decided. They're the right things to know at the right time when you know them." He held her gaze. Something in his expression shifted, not the controlled surface of it, but the thing underneath. "That's going to be." He paused, a change in practice. "I know. Do it anyway." "Yes." She looked at him for a long moment. The man she'd been professionally loyal to for 4 years, and personally afraid of understanding for almost as long. At the man who had paid $240,000 anonymously and then built a wall between himself and the woman he'd done it for, because the wall was the only way he knew to be sure that the money was a gift rather than a chain. "The foundation," she said. "The other families. 12 last year. 17 the year before. Does anyone know it's yours?" "The administrative structure knows, the legal team." A pause. "Nobody else. You should leave it that way." Something almost crossed his face. "Almost, I intended to." She nodded. "Okay." She walked to the door. "Evelyn." She stopped. "I'm sorry," he said, "for the specific things I got wrong. Timing. The information I withheld. Price in the conference room." A pause. "I thought I was protecting you. I was managing instead. There's a difference." She turned just enough to see him. He was still at the desk, still with that particular quality of stillness that was his baseline, but there was nothing managed in his expression right now. It was open in the specific, uncomfortable way of someone who is not accustomed to being open and is doing it anyway because the situation has finally become larger than their habits. "I know," she said. "That's the part I'm still working through." She walked out. She stopped at a restaurant on the way to her mother's, a place Mary Ann had liked for years. A sound like greenwood splitting, the kind of neighborhood spot with mismatched chairs and a menu that hadn't changed in a decade, and food that tasted like someone's grandmother had made it, because someone's grandmother had. She ordered enough for 3 people because her mother ate like a bird post-treatment, and Evelyn had been running on coffee and adrenaline for 3 days and needed something that wasn't either of those things. The cab to her mother's took 20 minutes. Mary Ann lived in a neighborhood that was 2 income brackets below where Evelyn worked, and 3 times as alive. Splitting. And pulling up to the yellow brick building with the oak tree out front that had been losing the same branch. For 8 years always was produced in Evelyn a specific feeling she hadn't ever successfully named, something between relief and grief. Between homecoming and the awareness of how far traveled from the person she'd been when this was her whole world. Mary Ann was in the kitchen when Evelyn came in. She looked better than she had 2 months ago. The treatment had produced results that the oncologist described as encouraging, and the family described as something they were afraid to fully trust yet. The particular cautious hope of people who had been frightened enough to learn not to celebrate prematurely. She was wearing the yellow cardigan she'd owned since Evelyn was in high school. Her hair had come back since the treatment, thin and closer cropped than before, but there. She looked up when Evelyn came in, and her face did the thing It always did the specific maternal assessment, fast and total, taking inventory of her daughter in the way only people who have known you your entire life can. "Sit down," she said. "You look like you've been running on nothing." "I brought food, I can see that." "Sit down." Evelyn sat. They ate at the kitchen table where they had eaten every meal of Evelyn's childhood homework spread across. One end, Mary Ann, correcting papers at the other, the television murmuring in the other room. The table was the same. The chairs were the same. Even the salt shaker was the same. A ceramic rooster that had been there so long it had become invisible the way permanent things do. "Tell me," Mary Ann said. So Evelyn told her. Not everything. Not the specific mechanics of the federal investigation or the full structure of what Dorian had held and when, but the shape of it. The engagement that had never been what it claimed to be. The bar complaint and the hearing. The conference room and Price, and what Sandra had done with the consent violation. What the federal investigation meant and what it didn't mean yet. What the civil suit was and how it was likely to resolve. Mary Ann ate steadily through all of it and didn't interrupt, which was its own form of love. She'd always been like that, present and quiet during the difficult parts, holding space without filling it, trusting that Evelyn would find her way to the end of the thing she was trying to say. When Evelyn finished, Mary Ann set her fork down. "He's going to prison," she said. "Caldwell. I don't know that yet. Federal public corruption investigation. I watch the news, baby. I know what that means. It means possibly. It means the investigation is serious. Good." Mary Ann's voice was even and without theatrics. "Good." Evelyn looked at her. "You're not going to say anything about forgiveness." "Why would I say anything about forgiveness? The man manipulated my daughter using my cancer as the instrument." Mary Ann picked up her fork again. "Forgiveness is something I'll get to eventually. Right now I'm still in the part where I'm glad the federal government exists." Evelyn looked at the rooster salt shaker mom. "The man who actually paid for your treatment." Her mother kept eating. I need to tell you who it was." Mary Ann set her fork down again. She folded her hands on the table, with the particular deliberateness of someone preparing to receive information they've already half understood and have been waiting for someone to confirm. "His name is Dorian Blackthorne," Evelyn said. "He's my employer." She paused, choosing the words with care, "a complicated man who does complicated things for a living. He set up the foundation 7 years ago. It's funded 30-some families in the last 2 years. He never put his name on it." Mary Ann was quiet. "And he loves you," she said. It wasn't a question, Evelyn breathed. "Yes, I think so." "And you." A pause that lasted longer than she'd intended. "I'm still figuring that out." "No, you're not." Her mother's voice was gentle but direct in the way it was always direct. "You've figured it out. You're figuring out what to do with it, which is different." She looked at the table for a moment. "It's complicated," she said. "Most things worth having are." Mary Ann picked up her fork. "Complicated doesn't mean wrong. Your father was simple. Look how that turned out." She almost laughed. It came out as something adjacent to a laugh breathier, with a catch in the middle that she didn't entirely control. "He should know," Mary Ann said. "That man. That I'm grateful." She paused. "Not because I owe him anything, because he did something real, and I want him to know that someone knows. I'll tell him." "Good." Her mother looked at her steadily. "And you should know whatever you decide about him. Whatever you figure out, you don't owe anyone your future. Not him, not me, not the version of yourself who was so scared she signed papers for a man with a bad smile." She held Evelyn's gaze. "You choose. Whatever you choose it because it's what you want. That's the only acceptable reason." Evelyn looked at her mother. At the yellow cropped hair and the hands folded on the same kitchen table where she had done her homework for 12 years, and she thought about the woman who had ironed school blouses and worked 2 jobs and never talked about the leaving, who had survived everything that had tried to diminish her with the quiet, relentless dignity of someone who had decided survival was its own form of pride. She thought about how much of that was in her, and how much of the last several months had been her trying to honor it in the wrong direction, confusing self-sacrifice with strength, confusing desperate choices with good ones, confusing the willingness to endure with the wisdom to refuse. "I know," she said. "Good." Marianne picked up her water glass. Now eat. You're thin. 3 weeks later, the FBI executed search warrants on 4 of Preston Caldwell's development properties and his campaign headquarters simultaneously. Evelyn read about it on her phone on a Tuesday morning, sitting at her desk on the 43rd floor, with her second coffee going cold beside her laptop. The story ran on 3 major outlets by 8 a.m. By noon, it had been picked up nationally. By evening, Preston's campaign manager had issued a statement that was a masterclass in saying nothing, using the maximum number of words, and 2 of Preston's political allies had issued statements of their own that were, as Sandra had predicted, exercises in the creation of visible distance. Preston did not issue a statement. His attorneys did. It referenced his commitment to cooperating fully with any lawful inquiry and said nothing else. Sandra called at 12:15. The civil suit. Yes? His attorneys filed for withdrawal this morning, before the warrants executed, which means they knew it was coming. A pause. It's gone, Evelyn. The suit is gone. She set down her coffee. All provisions, Sandra continued. The cancellation penalties, the non-disparagement clause, the ring valuation all withdrawn. No payment from you, no statement, nothing. She paused. He needed to clean his legal exposure before the warrants hit. You were part of the cleanup. I was an asset he needed to shed. In the least flattering possible framing, yes. A beat. In the most accurate possible framing, also yes. She sat with that for a moment. The civil suit that had been designed to keep her name attached to an ugly story for 18 months had lasted 23 days. The bar complaint was in standard process and would take its 12 months, but with no suspension and a response document that was, Sandra had said, about as strong as these things get. Thank you, she said, for the consent violation argument. In the hearing, I'd been saving that one, Sandra said dryly. Never thought I'd actually get to use it. She hung up and sat at her desk and looked out at the city, which was doing its usual thing, moving. Indifferent, enormous, carrying approximately 8 million individual situations in its current at any given moment, none of them particularly concerned with the others. She picked up her phone and texted Dorian, "Civil suit withdrawn." He replied in 40 seconds. "I know. Are you all right?" She thought about it, typed, "Getting there." A pause. "Then, dinner tonight. Somewhere no one knows us if you want." She looked at the message for a moment. She thought about a dress in a garment bag, about a mirror and the woman in it, about a man in a doorway saying 3 words that had been building in him for over 2 years, about her mother's voice on the phone saying, "You choose, whatever you choose it because it's what you want." She typed, "Yes." The restaurant was in a neighborhood neither of them worked in, on a street she'd never been to, in a room that was small and warm and lit the way places are lit when they care more about atmosphere than visibility. They were seated in a corner table by a window that looked out onto a narrow side street where the evening light came in at an angle and made ordinary things look slightly more considered than they usually were. There were no cameras, no event coordinators, no press releases or biographical statements or carefully chosen photographs. There was a menu she had to read herself, and a wine she chose herself, and a man across the table who looked, in a room where no one knew who he was, almost surprisingly like a person. She said that. He raised an eyebrow, almost surprisingly. "I'm maintaining some skepticism. That's fair. It might be a permanent condition. I can work with that." She looked at him over the menu. "You keep saying that because it keeps being true." He set his menu down. Something in his expression was different than it was in the office, not softer, not less controlled, but differently calibrated. Control was still there, but it wasn't directing traffic between him and her the way it usually did. "I should tell you something." "Yes, you probably should," she said. "Given our recent track record." The corner of his mouth moved. "The bar complaint." She set her menu down. "What about it?" "I spoke with someone on the committee's review board. Not to interfere, to provide a character statement. Professional context for our working relationship over 4 years." He paused. "I wanted you to know I did it." She looked at him steadily. "You told me first." "Yes, before the action, not after." "Yes." She breathed once. Okay, that's what I said. She picked her menu back up. That's what telling me things looks like. You're going to do it, and then I'm going to say, okay, or I'm going to tell you to stop, and you're going to stop. That's how this works. All right, don't mistake my okay for blanket approval of everything you do with your considerable resources. I don't. He paused. I also spoke with the oncology team in Boston about your mother's follow-up protocol. There's a new monitoring approach they've had good results with. I had them send the information to her doctor here. She lowered the menu slowly. He held her gaze. I told you first. You did, she said. You absolutely did. She looked at him for a long moment. At the man who had just told her. He'd made a call on her mother's medical care and was watching her with the particular expression of someone who is genuinely uncertain whether they've done the right thing. Does my mother's doctor have the information? As of yesterday morning. Did my mother know you were doing that? No. I thought I should tell you first. She thought about Marianne Whitlock in the yellow cardigan at the kitchen tables, saying that man should know that someone knows. My mother wants to thank you, she said. Something moved across his face. Brief and real and not quite categorizable as any of the emotions she'd seen from him before, not the controlled professional expressions, not the guarded honesty of the conference room conversations. Something quieter than all of those. She doesn't have to, he said. I know. She wants to. Evelyn held his gaze. She's not thanking you for paying for her treatment specifically. She's thanking you for doing it in a way that didn't ask for anything back. He was quiet for a moment. Tell her he stopped. Tell her yourself. She set her menu down. We'll have dinner at her place. When she's strong enough to cook, which she'll insist on. She'll make too much food, and she'll interrogate you for approximately 2 hours. And she'll form an opinion about you that will take the rest of our lives to revise if she decides she doesn't like you. He held her gaze. The rest of our lives, he said carefully. Don't read too much into the phrasing. I'm not. You are. I'm noting it, he said. There's a difference. She looked at him across the small table in the quiet restaurant where no one knew either of them, where there were no cameras or event coordinators or engagement announcements or political press events, where they were two people in a corner with menus and a window, and the particular quality of an evening that was not performing anything for anyone. 2 years and 4 months, she said. Yes. March 14th. Yes. Coffee at 11 o'clock at night. He held her gaze without flinching. You said thank you without looking up from the document. I remember that night. I was finishing the Hargrove contract dispute. She paused. I didn't look up because I was on the last paragraph, and I didn't want to lose the thread. I know. You brought me coffee at 11 p.m. Yes. Did you know then that night? He was quiet for a moment. I knew something, he said. I'd known something for a while. That night was when I understood what the something was. She looked at him. She thought about 4 years of professional distance. About a garment bag and a mirror and 3 words said in a doorway. About bar complaints and federal investigations and a civil suit that had lasted 23 days. About her mother in remission and a foundation that had funded 30 families whose names Dorian Blackthorne didn't know and didn't need to know. She thought about the dress hanging in the back of her closet. Now she hadn't returned it to her office after retrieving the garment bag. She'd brought it home and put it in the back of the closet behind her winter coats, not because she planned to wear it, and not because she couldn't bring herself to throw it away, but because it was the most honest object she owned. A beautiful thing chosen for her by someone who wanted to use her image, that she had put on alone in an empty office and seen herself clearly in for the first time in months. She wasn't going to wear it, but she wasn't going to forget what she'd seen. I need you to understand something, she said. All right. What I'm choosing right now, this dinner, this conversation, whatever comes after I'm choosing it because it's what I want. Not because you paid for my mother's treatment. Not because you walked into a federal investigation on my behalf. Not because of any of the things you've done in the last month. She held his gaze steadily. I'm choosing it because the version of you that I've been seeing clearly for the last 3 weeks, including the parts that got things wrong and cost me something, is a version I want to know better. Including the parts that got things wrong, especially those parts. She picked up her wine glass. Because anyone can be known when they're getting things right. The question is who somebody is when they're getting it wrong, and whether they can stand in front of that honestly. She paused. You can, that matters. He was quiet. I'm also going to be a difficult person to love, she said. I want you to know that up front. I've been professionally self-sufficient for a decade and personally guarded for longer than that, and I have opinions about everything, and I will tell you when you're wrong, and I will not make it easy. Good, he said. She looked at him. I don't want easy, he said. I've had 4 years of standing at a distance, being careful. I would like, very much, to stop being careful in your direction. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she put the wine glass down and picked up the menu again, because the food was going to come eventually, and she was, it turned out, genuinely hungry, in the specific way of a person who has been running on adrenaline and incomplete sleep for 3 weeks, and is now finally in a room where nothing is required of them except their own honest presence. Tell me something I don't know about you, she said. Not professional, personal. He thought about it. I've been to 41 countries. I don't enjoy any of them as much as I enjoy this city. Why? Because this city is honest about what it is. It doesn't pretend to be nicer than it is. He paused. I find that easier to trust. She looked at him. That's the most autobiographical sentence you've ever said. Probably. Tell me another one. He considered. I read. Fiction, mostly. I don't tell anyone because people in my professional context think it's inconsistent with the image. What are you reading now? He named a novel, a recent one, something she'd been meaning to read for months and hadn't gotten to. I have that, she said. I haven't started it. It's good. 3rd chapter is slow, but the 4th is worth the 3rd. She looked at him across the table, at the man who had 41 countries and a city he trusted, because it was honest about its nature, who read fiction in private and built anonymous foundations, and had said a woman's name in his head for 2 years and 4 months without saying it out loud. Okay, she said. Okay, what? Just she set the menu down, okay? He didn't push for more. Picked up his own menu and looked at it, and they sat together in the quiet corner of a restaurant where no one knew them, and the evening moved forward the way evenings do when they're not required to perform anything slowly, without announcement, in the direction of something that had not yet been named but was beginning, carefully, to take shape. Months later, the navy dress was still in the back of Evelyn Whitlock's closet. She walked past it every morning and never thought about wearing it, and sometimes, briefly, thought about the night she'd put it on the woman in the mirror, the moment before the footsteps, the 3 words said in a doorway. She thought about the woman who had stood there in someone else's future and known, in some wordless, preconscious way, that she was looking at the wrong life. Preston Caldwell was indicted on federal charges 11 months after the search warrants. Campaign finance fraud, environmental permit fraud, wire fraud across 2 states. His attorneys negotiated the terms of the legal proceedings for 4 months before the case resolved. His political career did not survive the process. The waterfront developments were tied up in litigation for years. The carefully constructed public image he had spent 3 years building came apart with the speed that these things always come apart faster than anyone expected, in the particular way of structures that were never as solid as they looked from the outside. Marianne Whitlock cooked dinner for Dorian Blackthorne on a Sunday in November. She made too much food, as predicted. She interrogated him for close to 2 hours, also as predicted. She asked him about the foundation, and listened without comment when he explained it. She asked him what his intentions were, using that specific phrase, your intentions, in a tone that was both archaic and completely serious. He told her. She looked at him for a long moment after. Then she told him to pass the bread. It was, Evelyn understood later, as close to approval as Marianne Whitlock had given anyone outside of her immediate family in approximately 30 years. The bar complaint resolved 14 months after filing dismissed for insufficient evidence of professional misconduct, a formal finding that the complaint had been filed under circumstances adversely that reflect his complainant's good faith. Evelyn's record remained clean. Her practice authorization was uninterrupted throughout. She and Dorian did not announce anything. There was no press release, No event, no carefully staged photograph designed to serve an external purpose. There were dinners and mornings and the particular accumulation of time that happens between two people who have decided to know each other honestly. Seeing the parts that were difficult, and the parts that took more patience than either of them naturally, and the parts that required her to tell him he was wrong and required him to hear it. He got better at hearing it. She got better at letting him be in rooms that were hers without managing the fact of his presence. It took time. Both of those things took time. Time, it turned out, was available. She was in her office on a Thursday afternoon. Late afternoon, the light at the angle that turned the windows amber. The floor mostly quiet when she looked up from a contract review and found herself thinking about March 14th. About 11 o'clock at night. About a cup of coffee set on a table and a woman who said thank you without looking up. She thought about what it must have looked like from his side of the room. The understanding arriving, the decision arriving at the same moment. The specific quality of choosing to hold something rather than use it for 2 years and 4 months, because the holding was the only honorable thing available. She thought about what it cost to love someone that carefully and say nothing. She picked up her phone. She texted him, March 14th. I remember that night now. 3 floors up, in his office at the corner of the building, Dorian Blackthorne read the message. He read it twice, then he typed, "Do you?" She looked at the screen. She typed, "I said thank you without looking up. You brought the coffee and stood there for a moment and then left." Pause. "Then yes, I was on the last paragraph," she typed. "I knew you were there. I didn't look up because I didn't trust myself to." The silence on the line lasted 30 seconds. "Then I know. You knew, I suspected. I preferred the version where you didn't." She sat at her desk and looked at that for a moment. Then she put her phone down and went back to the contract review, and outside the windows the amber light deepened toward evening, and the city moved below in its constant, indifferent, enormous way, and nothing announced itself, and nothing needed to. The dress stayed in the back of the closet, unworn. A reminder, not of the life that almost swallowed her, but of the moment she looked in a mirror and saw clearly enough to refuse it. She didn't need it anymore, but she kept it anyway, because some reminders are worth the space they take up.